Story 1. Why Tang Dynasty Couriers Slept in Treehouses. You wake in the pale light of dawn, though you are not in your own bed. Your body sways gently in a narrow wooden platform lashed between the branches of a cedar tree. Beneath you stretches a dirt road, quiet now, but yesterday it rang with the hooves of horses and the steady clatter of wheels. You are not a traveler here by chance, you are a courier of the Tang Dynasty, charged with carrying the emperor's words from one corner of the empire to the other. The Tang Empire, stretching across much of East Asia from the early 7th to the early 10th century, relied on a network of roads and relay stations known as the Yichuan system. These were not simple tracks, they were arteries of governance, carefully maintained for the movement of officials, military dispatches, and trade goods. And yet, for all the grandeur of the imperial infrastructure, there was one stubborn fact of geography. China's road system often cut through wild and remote landscapes. A treehouse in this context was not the whimsical child's retreat we might imagine. It was a functional, sometimes crude platform, built several meters above the ground. The logic was simple. Sleeping above ground kept a courier safer from wolves, bandits, and most importantly insects and snakes. In marshy regions, the elevation also kept bedding dry and reduced the risk of disease from stagnant water. The Tang Dynasty valued efficiency and survival, and so these treehouses became an unofficial but common element of the relay system. The courier's life was measured in li, the Chinese unit of distance, and in the weight of sealed bamboo tubes holding letters and decrees. Riding between stations meant covering 50-60 kilometers in a day, often switching horses at waypoints stocked with fresh mounts. The Yichuan stations provided food, but not always lodging. In less populated areas, or when time pressed, a courier would simply stop in a stand of trees, unroll a mat, and climb a rope ladder into a prepared platform. To understand why such practices endured, one must see the Tang not just as a political entity, but as a logistical machine. The empire was an intricate puzzle of governors, tax collectors, military commanders, and merchants, all of whom relied on timely communication. Roads followed rivers where possible, but they also cut across less plains, deserts, and mountain passes. Each route presented unique hazards. In the Gansu corridor, for example, wind and sand could strip flesh from exposed skin. In the humid south, the danger was disease and venomous wildlife. Treehouses provided not only safety but visibility. Elevated above the roadside, a courier could scan the horizon for movement, the dust plume of an approaching rider, the shimmer of heat over a riverbank, or the ominous stillness that might mean an ambush ahead. In an age without night vision or flashlights, height and moonlight could mean the difference between safety and disaster. The Tang court invested heavily in the relay system, with records knotting thousands of stations across the empire. These stations were staffed by local residents who were often exempted from certain taxes in exchange for their service. They maintained horses, stored grain, and repaired sections of road. The treehouses, however, were often the courier's own initiative, built during a lull in travel or inherited from earlier travelers. Some were simple platforms, others had partial roofs of thatch to keep off the rain. Historical records, such as the Tang Huiyao, Institutional History of the Tang, speak of the emperor's insistence on swift and secure communications. A decree from Chang'an to a provincial governor in the far south could take weeks, but only if every rider survived the journey. Bandits were a persistent issue, particularly in regions where imperial control was more nominal than real. While guard escorts could be provided for important missions, most couriers rode alone or in pairs to avoid attracting attention. A low fire at night might give away one's position. A high perch kept one both safer and less conspicuous. The rhythm of a courier's day was unglamorous, waking before sunrise, feeding and grooming the horse, tightening saddle straps, and checking the weight and balance of the mail pouch. Roads could be muddy in the rainy season or frozen in winter. Bridges were rare, and fording rivers was part of the job. At midday, a courier might eat cold millet cakes while still in the saddle. In the evening, after covering the day's distance, the choice of sleeping arrangements depended on the station's proximity. If the next station was within reach before nightfall, the rider might push on. If not, a solitary stop in the wilderness called for the familiar climb into the branches. The treehouse practice also intersected with another feature of Tang travel: messenger codes. Couriers carried small signaling devices, bronze mirrors for flashing sunlight, or flutes for sending specific notes down a valley. From an elevated position, these signals traveled farther. In mountainous regions, treehouses might be built on slopes, allowing a courier to send a prearranged flash or call to the next relay point. Even the construction of these shelters reveals a lot about Tang-era craftsmanship. The platforms were often made of split bamboo lashed together with hemp rope. In drier regions, pine or cedar branches served as the main beams, chosen for their resin content that deterred insects. A small notch carved into the trunk below the platform made it easier to anchor the rope ladder. A well-used treehouse might have faint traces of soot on its beams from a hanging lantern, or marks from the courier's bedroll being tied in place. Of course, treehouses were not without risks. A fall could end a courier's mission or life. In storms, the height that offered safety from predators also exposed the sleeper to lightning. Some couriers developed a habit of sleeping lightly, waking at the faintest creak of wood or rustle of leaves. This light sleep was both a survival mechanism and a side effect of a job that required constant vigilance. Through these details, the picture emerges not of a romantic adventurer, but of a practical, highly skilled worker, part athlete, part survivalist, part bureaucrat. They were the lifeline of a vast empire, and yet their accommodations were as humble as a few lashed poles swaying in the wind. But why did this practice remain so common even as the Tang developed more permanent lodging options at major stations? Was it simply habit, or did the treehouse offer some intangible advantage that brick and tile could not? You ride out of the branches just after dawn, the rope ladder still swaying behind you as you mount your horse. The air is cool, but the promise of heat lingers in the horizon haze. The pouch slung over your back carries the day's cargo, a set of sealed bamboo cylinders, each wrapped in oiled silk to protect the paper within. The seal cord is knotted in the imperial fashion: red silk for high priority, black hemp for lesser matters. Today's route cuts through a stretch of the central plain, where the road is broad enough for 2 carts to pass but still pitted from the last rainy season. The Tang Dynasty had road inspectors, but they came infrequently, and even then, their reports might take months to turn into actual repairs. You ride knowing that every pothole risks a turned ankle for your horse, and every fallen branch might hide something more dangerous. The Yichuan relay stations were the empire's promise to itself, a logistical skeleton holding together an enormous and varied body. But while official records depict them as orderly hubs of efficiency, reality was uneven. A station near the capital might be well stocked and run by literate clerks who logged every arrival. A station deep in the mountains might be little more than a shed, staffed by farmers who understood the duty as an obligation, not a livelihood. In both, however, the role was clear: to keep the road alive with movement. Treehouses fit into this system almost invisibly. They weren't an official construction project. No budget lines in imperial records mention elevated sleeping platforms. They were tools of adaptation, created by the couriers themselves or by local villagers who understood the needs of those who passed through. It's worth noting that Tang communications were more than just military or political dispatches. A courier might carry civil service examination results, tax records, border incident reports, or invitations to provincial banquets. Some of the messages were urgent, some were ceremonial, but all were wrapped in the same expectation of discretion and speed. There was no postal secrecy law in the modern sense, but an imperial courier was bound by oath not to tamper with the messages they carried. The punishment for doing so could be severe, ranging from exile to execution, depending on the gravity of the breach. Travel itself was a slow negotiation between the demands of the job and the realities of terrain. Rain turned dirt roads into slippery traps. Snow made navigation in the northern provinces a slow, punishing ordeal. In summer, the southern provinces swarmed with insect mosquitoes thick enough to darken a lantern's light. This is where the treehouse became more than just a perch. It was a refuge from the endless irritation of bites and stings. Smoke from a small brazier could be wafted upward to the platform, driving away pests without filling the sleeper's lungs with choking fumes. The design of these shelters varied by region. In the forested north, platforms were often solid planks nailed to the upper branches of a sturdy trunk, accessible by a notched pole rather than a ladder. In the more humid south, bamboo was preferred, its hollow culms light yet strong, bound together with water-resistant rattan strips. Some even had removable ladders, pulled up after dark to prevent unwanted visitors, human or otherwise, from climbing up. One of the unspoken benefits of sleeping elevated was psychological. A courier on the ground could wake to find themselves surrounded. A courier in a treehouse had a moment's warning before danger reached them. The small advantage of height meant the difference between panic and preparation. A bow kept within arm's reach could be strung in seconds. Even a thrown stone from above could deter a curious predator or a probing thief. Historical fragments give us glimpses of the treehouse habit in action. In one 9th-century letter from a provincial official to the Ministry of War, a complaint is lodged about messengers from the capital stopping in the tall pines beyond the ferry, causing disturbance to the village dogs. The remark is incidental but telling. The practice was so common that it could be remarked upon casually, without explanation. The work of the Tang courier also intersected with imperial politics in ways the writers themselves might not fully grasp. A simple directive carried from Chang'an to a border garrison could mean the shifting of troops, the opening of new trade routes, or the collection of emergency taxes. The man in the saddle did not decide policy, but his speed and reliability could shape its effect. A delayed message might mean reinforcements arriving too late. An early one could avert disaster. The relay system was also a mirror of the empire's health. When stations were abandoned or treehouses went unused, it was often a sign of deeper troubles: famine, rebellion, or the breakdown of local administration. In the Lushan rebellion of the mid-8th century, many of these routes fell silent. Couriers were pressed into military service or simply disappeared, their routes overgrown and their treehouses left to rot in the wind. It took decades for the system to recover fully. Night travel was rare but not unheard of. The moon was a courier's ally, casting enough light on clear nights to see the road. Yet it was also a time when bandits preferred to strike. In those hours, the treehouse became a hidden shelter, the rider's horse tethered below with its muzzle tied to prevent noise. Sometimes the courier would sleep fully dressed, boots still on, ready to descend at the first sound of hoofbeats or voices. What's striking is how little glamour there was in the role, despite its importance. Couriers were not remembered in poetry the way soldiers or scholars were. Their work was invisible. Success was measured in nothing happening. Messages arrived on time, orders were carried out, and life continued. The treehouse, in this sense, was emblematic of their work: functional, modest, essential, and overlooked. And yet one has to wonder, as the Tang state expanded its formal lodging at major stations, why did couriers still choose the precarious sway of a tree platform? Was it a habit formed in youth, a preference for solitude, or a survival instinct honed too sharply to set aside? Perhaps the answer lies not in logistics, but in the quiet comfort of being apart from the noise of the road, alone with the creak of branches and the distant rustle of leaves. The road has a way of folding days into one another. By the third week of travel, the taste of millet and the rhythm of the horse's gait become indistinguishable from the sound of wind in the trees. Every bend in the path is just another bend. Every station master greets you with the same mixture of suspicion and obligation. And yet, somewhere in this monotony lies the very heart of the Tang Dynasty's ability to govern such a sprawling empire: the dependable, unremarkable act of arrival. Treehouses, in their quiet way, were a part of that dependability. They asked nothing of the state: no tax allocation, no stone foundations, no official decrees. They were built when and where they were needed, used until they fell, and replaced when the need returned. They required no maintenance beyond a courier's occasional repair with a fresh length of rope or a new lash of bamboo. They were a self-sustaining solution born out of necessity, not policy. In the southern provinces, the practice persisted even as permanent roadside inns became more common. Inns, after all, were public spaces. A courier in possession of sensitive orders might wish to avoid the prying eyes of merchants, travelers, or even informants. A treehouse offered anonymity. From its perch, the courier could watch the road without being seen, slipping away at dawn before anyone knew they had been there. Moreover, the nature of imperial correspondence was not uniform. Some dispatches contained nothing more than mundane reports: a tally of grain shipments, a record of local tax compliance. Others could bear orders to mobilize troops, adjust tariffs, or investigate suspected sedition. In a political climate where allegiances could shift and local powers sometimes acted independently of the capital, discretion was more than a virtue; it was survival. One has to imagine the scene: a courier lying on a reed mat in a platform swaying gently above the earth, the night air thick with the scent of pine or camphor. Below, the horse shifts restlessly, tethered to a low branch. Somewhere in the dark, a fox yips, an owl's wings whisper against the leaves. There is no romance in it, only the discipline of rest before another day's ride. And yet, in these moments, the courier is both entirely vulnerable and entirely in control, suspended between the safety of height and the uncertainty of the road. Some treehouses were more elaborate than others. In areas with frequent courier traffic, villagers sometimes built multi-platform structures, connected by rope bridges or shared ladders. These could shelter 2 or 3 riders at once, though more often they were occupied by solitary travelers. The shared ones became informal meeting points, places where information could be exchanged, rumors shared, and riders could pass along advice about the condition of the road ahead: which station was short on fodder, where a bridge had washed out, which stretch of forest was rumored to harbor thieves. The Tang state, though centralized in theory, depended heavily on such informal networks. An emperor could issue an edict in Chang'an, but its reception at the far edge of the empire often relied on the advice of a single courier, warning the recipient that the garrison's morale was low, or that the harvest had failed in a nearby valley. These were not details that made it into the formal report, but they could influence the decisions of governors, generals, and tax collectors. The decline of the treehouse practice was gradual. As the Tang Dynasty matured, its infrastructure improved. More substantial stations were built, some with actual sleeping quarters for couriers. In certain provinces, local authorities began to forbid the use of treehouses, citing concerns about theft, injury, or even fire hazard in dry seasons. These prohibitions, however, were difficult to enforce in remote areas. The courier's job was defined by speed and adaptability. Stopping to seek formal lodging was often less efficient than simply climbing into the nearest tree. By the 9th century, the political stability of the Tang had begun to fray. Rebellions, warlordism, and the increasing power of regional military governors weakened central control. The relay network suffered. Stations went unstaffed, horses went unfed, and the once reliable schedule of message delivery became unpredictable. In such conditions, the treehouse was not just a preference but a necessity again, as couriers were forced to carry their own food and find their own shelter far from functioning stations. In the end, the treehouse's disappearance from the courier's toolkit came not from policy, but from the collapse of the system it served. As the Tang fell in 907, the relay routes fragmented under competing regimes. The couriers who once rode with imperial orders now found themselves in the service of smaller states, merchant guilds, or local lords. Without the unified network, The practice of roadside treehouses faded into local tradition, kept alive only where isolated villages still saw the occasional traveling messenger. Today, few physical traces remain. The bamboo and rope rotted away long ago. The trees themselves may have been cut down or grown wild. What remains are fragments in texts passing references in letters, stray complaints in administrative reports, or the poetic metaphor of messages sleeping in the branches, found in one minor Tang-era verse. Archaeology cannot recover the treehouses themselves, but the history of their necessity survives in the larger story of how the Tang moved ideas, orders, and authority across its vast domain. When you think about it, the practice says as much about human ingenuity as it does about imperial logistics. Faced with an endless road, the threat of danger, and the need for rest, couriers found a solution that required no permission, little material, and no cost to the state. It was simple, functional, and like much of history's quieter details, almost invisible until you look closely. Perhaps that is the true lesson hidden in the branches, that even in the machinery of great empires, the smallest, most personal choices where to sleep, how to stay safe, when to move unseen can shape the flow of history just as surely as battles or laws. And as you descend from the last treehouse on the last leg of your route, the road stretches ahead, just as it has for centuries, indifferent to the passing of dynasties, waiting for the next rider to carry the next message to the next place. Story 2. The medieval art of barrel making and its impact on trade. You stand in a dim workshop, the air heavy with the scent of oak and pine resin. The floor is littered with curls of shaved wood, and the rhythmic thunk of an adze echoes between the walls. Before you, a cooper, a medieval barrel maker, bends over a half-finished cask, coaxing the staves into place with the practiced precision of someone who has repeated this motion thousands of times. In an age before cardboard boxes, plastic containers, or steel shipping drums, barrels were the universal packaging solution. They stored wine, beer, salted fish, flour, gunpowder, and just about every other commodity that could be transported. They were strong, watertight when needed, stackable, and most importantly could be rolled, allowing heavy loads to be moved by a single person across a flat surface. A full cask of wine might weigh more than 250 pounds, but it could still be moved down a dock by one worker with careful rocking and rolling. In medieval Europe, the cooper's craft was not simply a trade, it was a linchpin of the economy. The word cooper comes from the Middle Dutch kuper, meaning tub maker, but the job involved a surprising level of complexity. A good cooper had to understand wood grain, moisture expansion, metalworking for the hoops, and the geometry required to make dozens of slightly curved staves fit together so precisely that they could hold liquid without glue or sealant. The material of choice was oak, especially in regions like France, England, and the German states. Oak was strong, worked well with tools, and in the case of wine, barrels imparted a desirable flavor. In coastal regions, coopers sometimes used pine or fir for dry goods, which didn't require the same liquid-tight seal. The type of wood used could signal the barrel's intended contents before it was even filled. The process began with cleaving or riving the oak into long, tapered pieces. These staves were shaped with a drawknife, their edges planed at subtle angles so that when arranged in a circle they would form a tight seal. The cooper then arranged the staves upright, temporarily bound them with a hoop, and began heating them over a small fire. This heat softened the wood, allowing the staves to be bent inward to form the barrel's bulging shape. The curvature wasn't just aesthetic, it gave the barrel strength and made it easier to roll. Iron hoops, often forged by the cooper himself or by a local blacksmith, were driven into place with heavy mallets. For barrels intended to hold liquids, the inside seams were sometimes treated with boiling water or steam to swell the wood and ensure a leak-proof fit. The heads, the flat top and bottom pieces, were fitted last, locked into grooves cut into the staves with a specialized tool called a croze. Every step required precision. Too much heat and the staves could crack, too little and they would resist bending. A misaligned hoop could cause the barrel to leak or burst under pressure. Even the iron had to be considered. Hoops too tight could crush the wood, too loose and the barrel would fall apart during transport. But why were barrels so important to medieval trade? The answer lies in their versatility and efficiency. A barrel could carry goods overland by cart, be rolled onto a ship, and then stored securely in a damp, shifting hold without damage. On sea voyages, barrels made use of space better than sacks or crates, fitting neatly against one another. They could also be repurposed. An empty wine cask might be washed and filled with salted fish, or turned into a storage vessel for grain. Unlike amphorae, which had dominated trade in the ancient Mediterranean, barrels didn't require constant crating or careful stacking. They were self-contained, portable, and most importantly durable. Guilds played a key role in maintaining quality. In many towns, coopers were organized into guilds that regulated apprenticeship, materials, and pricing. A journeyman might spend years learning the craft before being allowed to set up his own shop. Tools were costly, and so was good timber, meaning that a successful cooper often had arrangements with local foresters or shipyards to secure a steady supply. In port cities like Bordeaux or Lubeck, coopers were in constant demand, both for producing new barrels and repairing old ones. A ship might arrive with dozens of leaky casks in need of tightening, rehooping, or even partial rebuilding. This repair work was often done directly on the docks, with shavings and discarded hoops piling up alongside the moored vessels. The shape of the barrel itself became standardized across much of Europe not by decree, but by practicality. A slightly bulged middle made the barrel easier to grip with ropes or roll over rough surfaces. This bulge also meant that, when a barrel was dropped, it tended to land on its side and roll rather than striking flat and bursting. While barrels might seem mundane, their influence on commerce was profound. Entire economies adjusted their storage and shipping practices around them. For example, wine-producing regions calibrated their production to the size of standard casks. Brewers standardized their recipes to the volume of the barrels they sold in. Even tax collectors took notice, often levying duties per ton, a ton being a large cask of about 252 gallons. Over time, the word ton for weight derived from this measure, reflecting how integral barrels were to measuring bulk goods. And yet, for all their utility, barrels were not an invention of the Middle Ages. The Celts were already making them in the 1st century BCE, and the Romans quickly adopted the design for transporting goods to frontier garrisons. What changed in the medieval period was scale. As trade networks expanded, from the Hanseatic League in the north to Mediterranean spice routes in the south, the barrel became not just a container but a currency of logistics. Still, barrels had their limits. They were labor-intensive to make and required skilled craftsmen to repair. In regions without good timber, coopers had to import both wood and hoops, raising costs. Some merchants preferred sacks or bales for certain goods, especially if those goods could tolerate moisture or compression. But for liquids, fragile items, or anything that needed protection from pests, the barrel was unmatched. And so, the cooper's workshop hummed with steady work, season after season. Some barrels left the shop for local breweries or bakeries. Others would travel across seas and continents, carrying goods the cooper might never see or taste. His name would never appear in the ledgers of great merchants, but without his work, their trade could not function. But this raises an intriguing question. If barrels were so vital, how did their very design influence the way trade was organized, taxed, and even fought over in the medieval world? You step from the cooper's dim, wood-scented workshop into the bustling daylight of a medieval port. The air here is different, a thick, mingling blend of brine, fish, pitch, and sweat. Along the quay, barrels dominate the scene. They are stacked in neat rows, rolled down gangplanks, hoisted by cranes and lashed together in the holds of ships. Each one is not merely a container but a unit of measure, a symbol of value and in some cases a stand-in for currency itself. In much of medieval Europe, trade was quantified not in abstract volumes but in the physical form of the barrel. Merchants thought in tons, hogsheads, and firkins, each with specific capacities that could vary by region. A ton, at over 250 gallons, was the largest. A hogshead might hold about half that, while smaller measures like the firkin were used for beer or butter. Even customs duties were often assessed per barrel, and in some ports, inspectors measured goods by the barrel rather than by the pound or gallon. The taxman's interest in barrels was practical. Unlike loose goods in sacks or bundles, barrels were self-sealed, making it difficult to skim or alter quantities without leaving signs of tampering. A wax seal impressed on the plug that closed the fill hole could serve as proof that the contents were exactly what the merchant declared. For perishable goods like wine or olive oil, the barrel's tight seal preserved freshness during long voyages, protecting both buyer and seller from losses. In wine ports like Bordeaux, the annual Ban des Vendanges, the official opening of the grape harvest, was followed almost immediately by the work of coopers. Merchants and shippers swarmed to secure fresh casks, knowing that the sooner the wine was barreled, the sooner it could be shipped north to England or the Low Countries. A shortage of barrels could delay entire fleets. The Bordeaux wine trade in the 14th century, for example, was as dependent on oak forests in the land's region as it was on the vineyards themselves. The barrel's portability shaped trade routes in subtle ways. Unlike amphorae, which had to be crated and handled with extreme care, barrels could be rolled along quays and up ramps into warehouses. This reduced the number of laborers needed to move them, cutting costs and speeding turnover. In overland trade, barrels could be lashed to sledges or cart frames, or even floated down rivers. The Rhine, the Loire, and the Danube all saw barrels lashed together into makeshift rafts, drifting with the current to markets far downstream. Certain commodities became inseparable from their barrels in the public imagination. Salted herring, shipped from the North Sea and Baltic fisheries, arrived in markets still smelling of brine-soaked oak. Beer was measured not just in mugs or gallons but in firkins and kilderkins. Gunpowder, stored in specially lined barrels to prevent moisture penetration, was as much a product of the cooper's skill as of the powder maker. The craft also adapted to the needs of specific trades. Wine barrels, for example, were often made from seasoned oak to avoid imparting too much tannin, while barrels for salted fish were sometimes lined with pine tar for extra waterproofing. In Scandinavia, where pine was more common than oak, coopers learned to char the interior of barrels to neutralize the resinous taste. This charring, a technique later adopted by whiskey makers, also helped sterilize the wood. Barrels weren't only for transport, they were also storage units in homes, taverns, and monasteries. A brewery might keep dozens of casks stacked in a cool cellar, each topped with a chalk mark noting its age and contents. Monastic cellars often held both ale barrels and salted meat barrels, the latter serving as a food reserve during fasting seasons or poor harvest years. In towns, households without cellars sometimes stored barrels of water or preserved food in covered courtyards, the hoops rusting gently in the damp air. The cooper's role in this system was both humble and central. His name might never be recorded in the merchant's ledger, but the quality of his work determined whether goods arrived intact. A poorly made barrel could leak wine into a ship's bilge, soak through flour, or let in damp air that ruined salt. Merchants learned to recognize the marks of reliable coopers, sometimes requesting specific craftsmen when placing orders. In certain regions, coopers marked their barrels with a distinctive brand or stamp, both as a guarantee of quality and a subtle advertisement. Barrels even shaped the architecture of trade. In major ports, warehouses were designed with rolling bays wide, sloped entrances that allowed barrels to be rolled in directly from ships or carts. Dockside cranes were fitted with slings or netting to lift barrels in bulk. In smaller harbors, human chains of laborers would roll or carry barrels one at a time, their boots slipping on wet planks, the casks thudding into place like oversized chess pieces. Conflicts arose over barrels as well. In the Hanseatic League, disputes sometimes broke out over the size of barrels, as dishonest merchants sought to pass off undersized casks while paying duty as if they were full measure. Standardization efforts were patchy. One city's hogshead might be larger than another's, and wily traders could exploit these differences. By the 15th century, some ports required official gaugers to inspect and certify barrels before they could be loaded. The barrel's influence extended into military logistics. Armies on campaign needed mobile storage for food, ale, and powder. Barrels could be rolled along siege lines or floated across rivers. During the Hundred Years' War, English supply lines relied heavily on barrels to transport beer from Flanders to the front lines, the casks then repurposed to carry water once emptied. In the Crusades, barrels shipped from Europe to the Levant were sometimes dismantled and reused as building material for fortifications' oak staves, serving as palisades or roof supports. Yet despite their ubiquity, barrels had vulnerabilities. They required constant maintenance. Wood shrinks and swells with temperature and humidity, loosening hoops or opening seams. On long voyages, sailors sometimes had to tighten barrels by heating them over fires or re-soaking them in seawater to swell the wood. The sound of mallets ringing against iron hoops was a common one on ships, a maintenance rhythm as important as the creak of rigging or the splash of waves. Still, the barrel's combination of strength, mobility, and adaptability made it irreplaceable in medieval commerce. It was not just a container but an entire logistical system in miniature, one that allowed goods to move farther, faster, and more securely than many earlier methods. And like all effective technologies, it faded into the background, taken for granted until it failed. But this raises a further question. As maritime trade expanded into new oceans in the late medieval period, how did the barrel adapt to the harsher demands of longer voyages, new climates, and unfamiliar goods? The year is 1498, and you stand on the deck of a ship somewhere in the tropical heat of the Indian Ocean. The air is heavy with salt and tar, but the real scent of the voyage comes from below the mingled odors of dried fish, beer, olive oil, and vinegar, all sealed in the wood-and-iron embrace of barrels. The casks creak in the hold as the ship sways, their hoops groaning softly with the strain of heat and motion. By the late medieval period, European maritime trade had shifted from the coasts and inland rivers that had defined commerce for centuries into the vast and unpredictable waters of the Atlantic and beyond. This transformation brought new demands to the humble barrel. Now, casks had to survive voyages not of days or weeks, but months across wildly different climates, from icy northern seas to the sweltering equatorial belt. The wood would swell and shrink repeatedly as humidity shifted, testing the cooper's skill as never before. The basic form of the barrel remained unchanged, but construction adapted to these harsher demands. Ships' barrels were often made from the highest quality seasoned oak, sometimes reinforced with extra hoops to guard against the pounding of waves and the rough handling of longshoremen. For especially valuable cargo spices, fine wines, gunpowder merchants paid for barrels with tighter grain, carefully matched staves, and hoops forged from thicker iron. The result was a container that could withstand both the physical stress of the journey and the slow, creeping threat of tropical rot. The contents of barrels on these voyages were as varied as the trade routes themselves. Outbound from Europe, they carried textiles, metal tools, dried meat, and casks of wine or beer for the crew. Inbound, they returned filled with pepper from India, sugar from the Canary Islands, cod from the North Atlantic, and increasingly the dark, sticky molasses of the Caribbean. In each case, the barrel was more than just a vessel, it was a protective microclimate, shielding goods from moisture, pests, and contamination. One of the most significant developments of this period was the increased use of barrels for liquids in long-distance trade. Medieval wine and beer had been primarily local products, consumed relatively quickly after production. But with maritime shipping, Barrels allowed beverages to travel further, survive longer, and even improve in transit. The rolling motion of a ship could subtly agitate the contents, blending flavors and accelerating certain chemical changes. For some goods, this was a benefit matter. A wine, for instance, gained a reputation for its distinctive taste developed during long, hot voyages. Barrels also proved their worth in storing water, a critical factor in ocean travel. While casks could not keep water perfectly fresh for months, they did protect it from rapid spoilage far better than open containers. Ships often dedicated entire sections of the hold to fresh water barrels, carefully rotated and refilled at every port. Without them, the long voyages of exploration and trade would have been impossible. The cooper's role on a long voyage was not limited to making barrels before departure. Some ships carried skilled coopers among the crew, tasked with repairing casks in mid-ocean. A leaking barrel could mean the loss of valuable cargo or essential provisions. The repair process, heating the wood to swell it, replacing or tightening hoops, receding staves, was carried out on a rolling deck, sometimes in driving rain, with the knowledge that failure could threaten the success of the voyage. The barrel's dominance in shipping also influenced ship design. Cargo holds were built with the curvature of barrels in mind, their dimensions calculated to maximize how many casks could be stowed securely. Barrels were wedged in place with wooden chocks, rope lashings, or even other barrels, forming a tightly packed honeycomb that resisted shifting during storms. The geometry of the barrel's bulging middle, so useful on land, also made it a perfect shock absorber at sea, distributing impact forces evenly through its staves. Cultural exchange traveled inside barrels as well. Goods shipped in casks sometimes carried traces of their journey into new markets. Fish salted in northern Europe arrived in Mediterranean ports with a faint taste of the pine tar used to seal their barrels. Olive oil sent to northern cities brought with it the faint, sweet scent of the Spanish oak that held it. Even the barrels themselves could be commodities. Empty spice casks from the Indies, once emptied in European markets, were often resold for local storage, their interiors rich with lingering aromas. By the 16th century, the standardization of barrel sizes became more urgent. As global trade networks grew, merchants and governments alike sought predictable measures for taxation and pricing. While regional variations persisted, the ton, hogshead, and tierce became recognized across many markets, easing disputes and streamlining contracts. In some ports, official barrel gauges were installed, large wooden frames through which a cask had to pass to be accepted at the declared measure. Still, the barrel's importance was not immune to change. The rise of the industrial age in later centuries would bring crates, sacks, and eventually metal containers into competition. But in the medieval and early modern world, nothing matched the barrel's balance of strength, portability, and protection. It was a technology so effective that it persisted virtually unchanged for over 1,000 years. And so the cooper's work, though repetitive and unglamorous, stood at the center of a vast and growing web of exchange. His barrels rolled along the wharves of Venice, floated down the rivers of France, and crossed the equator under blazing sun. They held the commodities that built fortunes, fueled wars, and fed cities, all without fanfare or recognition. Perhaps that is why, in looking back, the barrel seems both utterly ordinary and profoundly important. Its presence in history is not marked by monuments or grand battles, but by the quiet fact that goods arrived where they were needed, in good condition, ready to be sold, consumed, or transformed. It was, in essence, the most boring of heroes, and in that ordinariness lay the true foundation of trade. Which leaves us with a thought. If something as simple and unchanging as a barrel could shape centuries of commerce, how many other overlooked tools of daily life have quietly steered the course of history without ever being noticed? Story 3. The Great Dust Ledger. Ottoman Empire tax records. You enter a long, narrow room lit by thin shafts of sunlight falling through high, arched windows. Dust drifts lazily in the air, stirred by the slow passage of a clerk carrying a bundle of rolled parchment. The air is dry, tinged with the faint scent of leather bindings, lamp oil, and the chalk used to mark tallies. Before you stretches a wall of shelves not filled with books, but with bundles of papers tied with faded red cord. Each is a record, each a transaction, each a tiny fragment of the Ottoman Empire's sprawling bureaucracy. The Ottomans ruled for over 6 centuries, from the late 13th century until the early 20th, and at their height, their territory stretched from the Balkans deep into the Middle East and North Africa. Governing such a vast and diverse empire required more than soldiers and governors. It required records, endless, meticulous records. Among the most important of these were the tax registers, known in Turkish as tarier defterleri. These were not small, neat account books. They were massive ledgers, sometimes the size of a tabletop, bound in leather and weighing as much as a small sack of grain. The tarier process was a careful, repetitive ritual. Survey teams made up of scribes, accountants, and local guides traveled from village to village, recording the number of households, the size of cultivated land, the crops grown, the livestock owned, and the taxes owed. These details were then entered into the central ledger, which would be stored in the imperial archives in the capital. The records served as the backbone for revenue collection and military provisioning. It is difficult to imagine just how physically demanding this work could be. The ledgers themselves were heavy, but so too were the journeys required to fill them. Ottoman scribes might ride for weeks along dusty Anatolian roads, carrying writing materials and sheets of parchment or paper. Once in a village, they had to set up in whatever space was available, often the corner of a mosque, a merchant's shop, or the home of the local headman, and painstakingly note each family's taxable resources. The clerks worked with reed pens, dipping them into ink made from oak galls and iron salts. The paper was durable but coarse, sometimes sourced from Egypt, sometimes from Italy, depending on trade and supply. Each page was ruled into neat columns, with spaces for names, figures, and notes about special conditions, whether a family was exempt from certain taxes, or whether land was newly reclaimed from marsh or scrub. The handwriting was small but elegant, written in the distinctive Ottoman Divani script, a flowing style designed for both beauty and efficiency. Why so much dust? The archives of the Ottoman state were vast, and the buildings that housed them were not always sealed against the elements. Paper absorbs the air around it, and over decades, a fine powder of dirt, sand, and even the remnants of insects would settle on the ledgers. Archivists did their best to protect them, wrapping the most important in cloth or storing them in chests, but the sheer volume of material meant that much of it sat in the open. The smell of dust, in fact, became so associated with the imperial archives that later Ottoman officials referred to visiting them as going into the dust. The value of these ledgers was immense. A well-kept record could determine the flow of revenue from a province for decades. They also served as a tool for military organization, since taxes were often collected not only in coin, but in goods, grain, wool, horses, or labor. A tax record showing a surplus of sheep in one district might lead to that district supplying wool for army uniforms, while another rich in barley might be tasked with provisioning cavalry mounts. The bureaucrats who maintained these ledgers were part of a class known as the Kailmii, the scribal institution of the empire. Their work was not glamorous. Few poets wrote verses praising the men who counted chickens and weighed sacks of grain. Yet their role was critical. Without accurate records, the empire's delicate balance of taxation and expenditure could collapse. A tax shortfall in one province could mean a garrison unpaid, a road unrepaired, or a famine unrelieved. Ottoman taxation was not uniform. Some provinces paid fixed annual sums, others paid variable amounts based on production. The tarier defterleri captured these variations in fine detail, listing not only the numbers but often the reason for the arrangement. A mountain village might pay less because its land was poor and rocky. A river town might owe more due to the profits from fishing or ferry tolls. The system was both rigid and flexible, rigid in its insistence on record keeping. flexible in its adaptation to local realities. For the modern historian, these ledgers are a goldmine. They reveal patterns of settlement, economic shifts, even climate change. A sudden drop in grain yields might signal a drought. A sharp increase in sheep could indicate new pastures being opened. But for the Ottoman clerks who made them, the purpose was entirely practical: to ensure the steady flow of taxes to the state. There is a strange kind of power in the quiet of a record room. Here, far from the battlefields and palace intrigues, the fate of provinces was tallied in neat rows of ink and parchment. The numbers could condemn a village to heavier taxation or grant it relief. They could justify a governor's replacement or cement his position. And yet, for all this power, the work was invisible to most of the empire's subjects, who saw only the local tax collector and not the chain of entries that stretched back to the capital. But this raises a question. If the tax registers were so vital, how did the Ottoman state ensure their accuracy, and what happened when those numbers were deliberately manipulated? You sit at a low table in a provincial guest room, a reed pen between your fingers, the grit of pound sand whispering across damp ink. Outside, a donkey brays. Inside, the room is full of the small sounds of bureaucracy: a clerk's quiet counting, the creak of a leather spine, the soft thud of a seal. If the empire lives in its roads and forts, it breathes through this work, the steady, boring discipline of making numbers behave. The Ottomans did not trust numbers simply because they were written. They trusted the process that produced them. A Tahrir survey was as much choreography as it was mathematics, a layered performance designed to make lying difficult and to make truth emerge by repetition. At its heart stood a small traveling team, a Tahrir Emini, survey commissioner, who held authority for the count, a Katib scribe, who could write fast and neat, one or two local guides who knew fields and families by name, sometimes a janissary or sipahi for backbone, and always a caddi's court nearby to solemnize disputes. The day began with summoning the village headmen. They came to the mosque portico or the courtyard of the chief's house, removing shoes at the threshold. Names were recited aloud, so were obligations. A village was not a fiction. It was a woven mat of Hain households, fields, pensions, exemptions, converts, widows, bachelors, craftsmen, and shepherds. You took them in order, the spiral of ink moving from the obvious to the arguable. A field that had been fallow for 3 years might be treated differently from one neglected a single season. A widow with 2 sons might owe a different resume from a bachelor living with his uncle. The surveyor looked at people and land together and called that combination revenue. The mechanics of truth-making were dull by design. First, you produced a Mufassal defter, the detailed register in which every household and plot was recorded. Later, you compiled an Ikmal defter, a summarized ledger that collapsed the detail into neat totals. The two were kept separate and copied by different hands, often in different places, so that any attempt to massage the sums would have to defeat duplication as well as oversight. Margins mattered. A correcting mark, a diagonal slash, the word tassi, corrected, each left a trace no clerk wanted next to his name. You relied, too, on rhythm and comparison. The team carried older defters and read them aloud when necessary. 3 households in the last survey. How many now? A sudden swell of widows or bachelors would draw suspicion, because taxes in the Ottoman rural system could be calibrated by marital status. Resume sift, full holding tax, for a married farmer with a team and plow. Resume benak for a married man of lesser holding. Resume musurd for a bachelor. Classifying people as poorer could lighten their burden. Doing so suddenly and en masse could also be a way of strangling state revenue. So the ledger's first defense was memory. It was not like this before. Why is it like this now? The caddi's court anchored honesty with ritual. Oaths were taken under the judge's eye. Village headmen swore to the truth as far as they knew, a phrase as elastic as agriculture itself. Disputes: a contested boundary, a tax-exempt whack field, a ruined mill were written into the record as notes, not erasures. The state preferred friction that could be revisited to neatness that hid a lie. When a new governor challenged an old arrangement, the dusty note in the margin became a small shield. This was considered, and here is how. You might think fraud required imagination. In practice, it relied on monotony. A timber-holding cavalryman, a Sipahi, might prefer that a neighboring village's potential be understated, so that his own income looked steady and deserving. A tax farmer under Iltizam might overstate production during bidding season to win the right to collect, then later plead poor yields to keep more coin. A village might temporarily split households to create more bachelors at lower rates, then recombine when the clerks were gone. The counterweight to these arts was not brilliant detection but repetitive presence. The state returned. It counted again. It asked the same questions in a slightly different order. It compared the answers village to village, district to district. You learned, as a surveyor, to read the countryside as a page. Mills that sat in silence told you something about water levels and harvest expectations. Fresh irrigation channels told you something about ambition. If a village that previously paid little in Avariz extraordinary levies now claimed hardship, you looked for signs: the stripped beams of abandoned houses, or the telltale weeds that colonize unused thrashing floors. The clerks were not detectives, they were patient. They did not need a confession if the field spoke. At the provincial level, the Defterdar treasurer or his deputy reviewed the Eichmel Defterlery. Totals from dozens of villages were tested against expected revenue from comparable districts. Discrepancies did not always prove malfeasance. They could signal flood, drought, locusts, or war. But a pattern, a gentle downward slope of numbers across a governor's tenure, for example, invited a teftish, an inspection. Inspectors were dreaded not for their brilliance but for their paperwork. They stalled careers, delayed payments, and froze favors. That was punishment enough to make many officials choose dull honesty over creative accounting. Even the paper itself participated in securing truth. Pages were numbered in ink and sometimes pricked with small needle marks along the spine to show if a sheet had been replaced. The binding thread was knotted in a way clerks recognized and could later check. On important books, the first and last pages bore a judge's notation with date and place. Tampering required daring and collusion. Both left trails that colleagues, rivals, or successors might one day want to reveal. The system did break. It always does somewhere. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Selali rebellions and the general churn of inflation and silver influx shook the counts. Villages moved. Households vanished into forests or cities. Scribes had to accept absence as a category for people who were neither dead nor paying. In those years, the margins filled with resignation. The people have fled. A number can be made honest, but it cannot make someone stay in a famine or a war. Before that unraveling, though, and after it in calmer stretches, you see how deliberately the Ottomans nested their checks. The timur system, in which Sipahis received revenue rights from specific villages in exchange for military service, tied local knowledge to imperial interest. A Sipahi had reason to want accurate counts. Too low, and his income shrank. Too high, and his peasants fled and his long-term revenue with them. The state, wary of the Sipahis' temptation to shade numbers for short-term ease, interposed the caddi, the defterdar, and the traveling surveyors. Not a neat triangle but a web. Village, cavalryman, judge, treasurer, and scribe, each tugging a little against the others. You see it most clearly in the handling of exemptions. A road guard community Derbensi might maintain a mountain pass and pay less in tax. A Uruk nomad band might be enrolled for seasonal military labor and taxed differently for herds. A Waqf endowment's fields might be legally shielded to fund a school or soup kitchen. Exemptions multiplied in the margins, and with them the opportunities to cheat. A governor could curry favor by rubber-stamping exemptions. A judge could resist. A survey team could reclassify. None of this was dramatic. It was the quiet physics of a large state: pressure, counterpressure, and the slow, usually boring restoration of balance. The most common manipulations were minor. A family tried to register as two households to downgrade a resume sift to two benek. A widow's son insisted he was a bachelor to pay less, although his tools and oxen told another story. A miller unreported throughput to lower his dues. The clerks did not need to prove intention, they needed plausibility. A measuring stick on a thrashing floor. A walk along the irrigation ditch. A count of ox teams against plowland. You learn not to lecture, but to subtract. Conscience played its role, if only because routine breeds a kind of austere pride. A katib who could draw a clean column of figures without blot or crossing out did not want to see his pages marred by an inspector's red slash. He trimmed his pen carefully. He sprinkled sand lightly. He blew once, never twice. When you spend your days making straight lines, you begin to dislike the men who bend them. That is not a moral system, but it helps. Still, the incentives changed. As iltizam tax farming grew in the 16th century, and later as Malakane life-term farms were granted, some of the old balance gave way to harder bargains. A successful bidder for a district's revenues had every reason to paint an optimistic picture when the contract was signed, and to claim misfortune later. Here, too, the state's answer was repetition and comparison. A new contract might be benchmarked against an old Eichmel. A sudden collapse in receipts would prompt a visit, not a sympathy note. The paper did not believe tears. The worst falsifications were pious. A field was declared waqf to support a pious foundation, but the rent flowed to a governor's cousin. A road guard community claimed duty but neglected the pass. The record's defense was not a crusade against hypocrisy. It was paperwork that tied acts to obligations. If the soup kitchen did not boil, if the pass was not patrolled, exemptions could be struck out in the next survey, a neat black line through sacred words. None of this made for thrilling history, but it turned piety back into arithmetic. What happened when numbers were deliberately manipulated? Sometimes nothing at first. A village paid less for a few years, a sipahi grumbled but coped, a tax farmer bought one less horse. Then the ripples met. A garrison missed its stipend, wheat failed to move to a famine district, a bridge repair was delayed. The empire's response was not flames but visits. Inspectors, surveyors, judges, couriers stalled. Exemptions were rescinded. A book was copied again. The sensation of punishment was timed the unglamorous slow walking of favors more than spectacle. Accuracy was also pursued sideways. Cross-records help historians today, and they helped administrators then. If a fishing town's customs book showed brisk trade while the tarrier said the town was poor, someone asked questions. If a waqf ledger recorded rents that a district's tax summary somehow missed, comparisons were made. You do not need forensic accounting to catch a lie when two honest books disagree. You need patience and a table big enough to hold them both. Material life leaked into the margins, and those leaks served truth. A note about a collapsed bridge explained a revenue dip. A list of widows after an epidemic justified leniency. The clerks did not moralize, they annotated. In this way, the dust ledgers became more than tax books. They became low, persistent chronicles of weather, pests, prices, and sorrow. They made room for the boring reality that people die, run, marry, and harvest late. And then there was fear not of the lash, usually, but of the future. Every entry implied a future claim. A number written today would be used tomorrow to demand coin or grain. It is easier to be honest when you know your own hand will be read by someone like you in 20 years. The Ottoman scribal class, the Kalmii, did not simply pass through. It reproduced itself. Apprentices watched masters. Masters remembered their own apprenticeships. Very few wanted to leave a reputation for crooked columns. Of course, the system's very solidity could freeze injustice in place. A mistaken classification, a family miscounted, a field mismeasured could ossify into how it has always been. The state's love of regularity could harden mercy into exception and exception into loophole. Precision is not the same as fairness. The ledger could be accurate and wrong at the same time, and people could live under that mistake for a generation. The Ottomans had mechanisms to reopen questions, petitions to the divan, local suits before the cadi, special surveys after disaster, but each required time, connections, or luck. Paper is a faithful servant and a poor listener. Sitting there with your reed pen and your sand shaker, you see the empire's paradox. It wanted accounts that were both exact and forgiving, both strict and adaptable to drought, war, and flood. It tried to get there not with genius but with rhythms. Survey, summarize, compare, inspect. Swear, write, seal, copy. If the result was something like honesty most of the time, it was because boredom itself, the patient repetition of dull work, has a way of grinding down lies into manageable dust. Yet a doubt remains. What happens when the world changes faster than the ledgers can be recopied, when silver floods the markets? Soldiers demand cash stipends instead of grain, villages empty into cities, and exemptions multiply past counting. If the book is careful and the world is not, which one finally wins? The ledger you untie is immaculate, ink sharp, columns steady, the seal at the bottom pressed deep into the paper. At first glance, it could have been written yesterday. Yet you know it is decades out of date, its rows now ghosts of a countryside that no longer exists. Villages listed here are abandoned. Fields marked as fertile are choked with scrub. The bridge noted as sound fell into the river 2 summers ago. The numbers remain perfect only because they are no longer about reality. This was the quiet crisis of the late Ottoman Tarir system. The world changed faster than the ledgers. For centuries, the rhythm of surveys had matched the rhythm of agriculture, inheritance, and settlement. The gap between a household counted and a household changing was small enough that tax demands, troop levies, and supply allocations could be met without too much distortion. But beginning in the late 16th century, pressures mounted that the old cadence could not absorb. War was the first accelerant. The Selali uprisings in Anatolia and the long wars against the Habsburgs and Safavids displaced thousands. Refugees streamed into fortified towns or migrated into mountain areas beyond easy survey. In the defters, these households still existed, still tilled their plots, still contributed their resin. On the ground, they were gone, and the gap between paper and reality became a fiscal chasm. Governors, desperate to meet quotas, leaned harder on the villages that remained, driving more families into flight. The second accelerant was money. The influx of New World silver through European trade routes destabilized Ottoman prices. Soldiers, artisans, and merchants demanded cash wages, and tax collectors pressed for coin instead of payment in kind. The Tarir system, built on the assumption of a mixed economy where grain, wool, and labor were valid forms of tax, struggled to track purely monetary obligations. You could measure a sack of barley and store it in a granary. A coin could vanish into a sleeve between the village and the treasury. Urbanization added another twist. As cities like Istanbul, Aleppo, and Cairo swelled, rural populations thinned. Some families kept a nominal presence in their home village to retain land rights but lived and worked year-round in the city. In the ledger, they were still farmers. In reality, they might be porters, shopkeepers, or soldiers. The tax category, full holding, sift hain, no longer matched the actual labor on the land. Yet unless a new survey was ordered and expensive, slow process, the fiction persisted. The Ottomans were not blind to the slippage. They had stopgaps. Extraordinary levies, avaries, could be imposed in wartime without waiting for a full survey, and these could be adjusted according to visible prosperity rather than the frozen numbers in the Tarir. Military requisitions, market inspections, and customs records offered alternate views of economic activity. But none of these were as comprehensive or as regular as the grand surveys, and all were more vulnerable to local bargaining and concealment. By the 17th century, the Tarir system itself began to fade in many provinces. Some regions abandoned periodic surveys altogether, shifting instead to fixed-sum tax farming under the Iltizam and later Malakane systems. In these arrangements, the state auctioned the right to collect taxes to the highest bidder, who paid the treasury up front and kept whatever he could gather. On paper, this reduced administrative costs. In practice, It untethered tax collection from the careful, village-level accounting that had once underpinned imperial revenue. The loss was not just fiscal. The Tahrir Defterlery had doubled as a political map of the empire, recording not just who paid what but who lived where, what land was cultivated and which institutions, mosques, schools, endowments anchored each community. Without new surveys, the state's knowledge of its own terrain decayed. The ledger became a relic, precise, dignified, and useless. Still, the old books were kept. Ottoman bureaucratic culture prized preservation, and even obsolete ledgers were stored in archives, wrapped in cloth and stacked in numbered sequence. Their very survival helped maintain the illusion of continuity. As long as the books existed, the order they described might be imagined to persist. Officials could still quote figures from the Defter to justify decisions, even if every man in the room knew the figures no longer matched the earth. There were moments when the fiction became untenable. A famine in one province could not be explained away when grain deliveries fell short across the board. A military campaign that found a supposedly well-provisioned district empty of men and livestock revealed the hollowness of the paper record. In such moments, emergency surveys Yaklama were dispatched, stripped-down counts meant to capture the essentials: who was there, what they could pay, what they could provide. These were blunt instruments, trading depth for speed, and they often bypassed the careful categorizations of the old Tahrir. Ironically, the very dust that settled on the ledgers became part of their symbolism. In Ottoman idiom, pulling a book from the dust could mean reviving an old practice or recalling a long-forgotten truth. Archivists spoke of the Tazlu Defter, the dusty ledger, with a mix of respect and resignation. These were monuments to an era when the empire could still map itself with confidence, when every village and field had a place in the state's memory. For the historian, the obsolescence of the Tahrir is a gift as well as a loss. Because the books froze the world at the moment of their making, they offer a snapshot unblurred by later change. We can see the layout of a 16th-century Anatolian district, the names of its households, the crops in its fields, the mills on its streams. We can trace the economic weight of a Balkan town before war and migration transformed it. We can even glimpse climate shifts in the rising and falling yields of barley and wheat. The ledger failed as a living instrument of governance, but it endures as a time capsule. And in that endurance lies a lesson. Numbers are not truth in themselves. They are agreements about what will count as truth for the purposes at hand. In the age of the Tahrir, the agreement was that land, households, and taxable output were the pillars of the state's wealth and strength. When war, money, and migration changed the pillars, the agreement cracked but the books remained, holding on to their old definitions like a language no longer spoken. Perhaps that is the most telling image of the Great Dust Ledger. A volume bound in leather, its pages ruled in black and red, its script still legible after centuries, and yet speaking faithfully only of a world long vanished. It is a reminder that even the most meticulous systems, designed to be timeless, are bound to the pace of the lives they measure. And it leaves a question worth carrying into the next story. In the long span of history, is it better for a state to preserve the appearance of order on paper, or to admit in ink, in numbers, that the order has changed beyond recognition? Story 4. Roman Aqueduct Maintenance Schedules. You are standing on a stone embankment in the cool of an early Roman morning. Beneath you, a slow but steady stream of water slides along a narrow, elevated channel, the speck its surface broken by the occasional ripple of a leaf or insect. The water's journey has already been long, drawn from springs miles away, carried on arches and through tunnels, channeled past hillsides and over valleys, until it arrives here, at the outskirts of the city. You see no drama in it, only rhythm. But it is precisely this rhythm that kept Rome alive. By the height of the empire, Rome was fed by 11 major aqueducts, each with its own source, route, and schedule. Together, they supplied hundreds of millions of gallons of water daily, enough for public baths, fountains, gardens, industry, and the private homes of the wealthy. Yet this constant abundance was not simply a matter of construction. It was a matter of maintenance. Stone, mortar, and lead pipes do not keep themselves in order. Without inspection, cleaning, and repair, even the grandest aqueduct would choke with silt, leak from cracks, or collapse outright. The Romans understood this well. They recorded not just the building of aqueducts, but their upkeep, a network of routines, inspections, and schedules that might seem dull until you imagine what happened without them. An aqueduct falling into disrepair meant public fountains running dry, baths closing, mills stopping, and in the worst case, outbreaks of disease from stagnant or contaminated water. The Cura Aquarum, the office responsible for Rome's water, was as much about prevention as supply. At the head of this system was the Curator Aquarum, a high-ranking official often drawn from the senatorial class. His responsibilities were broad, overseeing the flow of water, managing disputes over usage, and crucially, ensuring that maintenance crews did their work. Beneath him were engineers, inspectors, castellarii, and laborers who carried out the actual cleaning, patching, and rebuilding. The Frontinus, a famous 1st-century treatise by Sextus Julius Frontinus himself, a curator aquarum, describes in exacting detail the organization needed to keep the system running. The schedules were seasonal. In spring and autumn, when flow rates shifted with rainfall and temperature, inspections intensified. Spring was a time to clear silt and algae from channels, repair frost damage from winter, and check the joints where stone met lead pipe. Autumn inspections focused on clearing debris brought by seasonal storms and ensuring that the aqueduct could handle the winter's reduced but colder, sometimes freezing flow. Every section of an aqueduct had to be walked. Inspectors carried rods to measure width and depth, marking spots where lime deposit center had narrowed the channel. These deposits could grow like mineral stalactites along the walls, slowing flow and catching debris. Removal was laborious. Workers chipped away at the buildup with iron tools, careful not to crack the stone beneath. In tunnels, where lime deposits could form jagged shelves, this work was done by lamplight in the damp echo of dripping water. Leaks were another constant problem. Water might seep through mortar joints or fracture lines in the stone. Small leaks could be patched with quicklime mortar, but larger breaks demanded replacing entire blocks or segments of pipe. Lead conduit, used for distributing water into the city, was prone to cracking under stress or corrosion. The Romans used sleeve joints to repair sections without dismantling entire runs, and they scheduled inspections to catch such faults before they grew. Vegetation posed its own threats. Roots from nearby trees could infiltrate cracks and joints, prying them open as they grew. The solution was simple but relentless. Cut the trees, dig out the roots, and keep the channel clear. This too became part of the maintenance schedule, not once, but regularly, because nature, like water, never stopped working against stone. One of the less visible but essential tasks was cleaning the casella, the distribution tanks where water from the main aqueducts was divided into smaller channels. Silt, algae, and debris collected here, especially if the flow slowed. Cleaning required diverting the water, a disruption that had to be timed carefully to avoid cutting supply to critical areas. Inscriptions survive that record such diversions, showing that Rome scheduled them like a modern city schedules maintenance on power grids, deliberately, publicly, and with as little interruption as possible. This level of care extended beyond the city of Rome. Provincial towns with aqueducts from Gaul to North Africa adapted similar schedules, often on a smaller scale but with the same principles. Even the smallest aqueducts had crews assigned to walk the length, scrape the channels, patch the mortar, and clear vegetation. In many towns, the rhythm of maintenance was tied to civic pride. A clean, smoothly running aqueduct was a visible sign of order and prosperity. The work was not glamorous. Laborers scraped and hauled under the sun, balancing on narrow ledges of stone, or wading knee-deep in cold water through a tunnel. They carried baskets of lime, bags of sand, and iron tools up steep embankments. In the city, they worked in crowded streets, dismantling paving stones to reach buried pipes, then replacing them before the day's traffic returned. Yet without them, Rome's famous abundance would have been an illusion. The scheduling of all this depended on records. The Romans kept logs of inspections and repairs, noting dates, locations, and the nature of the work done. These records, whether on tablets or papyrus, allowed the curator aquarum to track which sections were due for attention and to coordinate teams so that no critical artery was neglected. This bureaucratic layer, invisible in the arches and flowing water, was the true spine of the system. The maintenance schedule also enforced fairness. In Rome, water was not evenly distributed. Wealthy households and industries could secure larger shares, sometimes illegally tapping the mains. Regular inspections were as much about detecting unauthorized connections as about fixing leaks. In fact, Frontinus complains at length about illegal tapping, describing it as one of the main challenges to managing the system. The schedule, in this sense, was also a form of surveillance. And yet, one wonders, given the complexity and manpower required, how did the Romans keep such a vast system coordinated year after year, across seasons and political changes, without letting decay get ahead of them? The answer to how Rome kept water flowing year after year, despite war, political upheaval, and the sheer size of the system, lies in something as unglamorous as it is effective: routine backed by law. The aqueducts were not treated as heroic monuments, though they certainly looked the part, but as public utilities subject to an unending cycle of inspections, repairs, and oversight. The Romans did not rely on goodwill or civic pride alone. They codified maintenance into a framework of obligations that made water management as inevitable as the sunrise. At the heart of this framework was a division of responsibility. The curator aquarum oversaw the system as a whole, but much of the day-to-day work fell to subordinate officials and crews divided by function. The castellarii were custodians of the castella, the distribution tanks each assigned to specific junctions and channels. The aquarii handled technical aspects of flow regulation, operating sluices and valves to divert water where needed. Then there were the structors, masons, tectors, plasterers, and fabri craftsmen who patched, rebuilt, and reinforced the physical structure. These roles were not temporary assignments. They were ongoing posts, funded by the state and sometimes supplemented by local benefactors. Inscriptional evidence shows that wealthy citizens occasionally financed a stretch of repair or an additional inspection team, often in exchange for public recognition. This blending of public administration and private patronage gave the system resilience. When the state's budget faltered, local pride or ambition could still keep a section flowing. The maintenance calendar was tied to both climate and usage. Spring inspections prepared for the heavy demand of summer baths and gardens. Late summer and early autumn brought another wave of work, clearing debris from seasonal storms. Winter maintenance focused on frost-prone areas, especially in aqueducts that crossed high ground or ran through exposed stone channels. In colder provinces, exposed sections were insulated with stone slabs or covered entirely to reduce ice damage. Inspection methods were simple but relentless. Crews walked their assigned sections with rods and markers, measuring the water's depth and width at key points. Any deviation from expected levels too low, suggesting a leak upstream, or too high, suggesting a blockage, triggered an immediate search for the cause. Where channels ran underground, access shafts were opened, and workers descended with lamps to scrape deposits and check for cracks. In some cases, wooden planks were floated along the channel to test the current. A snag or sudden slowdown signaled obstruction. The removal of calcium deposits, or sinter, was perhaps the most physically demanding task. Over time, mineral-rich water left thick crusts that narrowed channels and reduced capacity. Workers used chisels and hammers to break away the buildup, often working in water up to their knees or waists. The debris was hauled out in baskets and dumped far from the aqueduct's edge to prevent it from washing back in during rains. Leak repair varied depending on the material. Stone channels could be patched with quicklime mortar, which set rapidly even in damp conditions. Brick or concrete sections required repointing of joints and, in some cases, replacement of entire blocks. Lead pipes, especially the distribution pipes branching from casella, were repaired with sleeve joints or replaced entirely. Plumbers, plumbara, carried strips of lead and portable forges to melt and mold patches on site. The schedule also included vegetation control. Grass and shrubs along embankments were cut back to prevent root infiltration. Larger trees near channels were felled, their stumps dug out to discourage regrowth. This was not just about protecting the structure. Overgrown sections provided cover for illegal tapping. An open, well-kept channel was easier to monitor. One of the most important and least visible elements of the schedule was cleaning the casella themselves. These distribution tanks often acted as sediment traps, catching sand, silt, and debris before water was sent into smaller pipes. Over time, the sediment could build up, reducing volume and pressure. Cleaning required temporary diversions, so it was done on a rotating schedule, ensuring that no part of the city went without water for more than a few hours. To keep all this moving, records were kept with near-obsessive care. Each section's inspections and repairs were logged on tablets or scrolls, noting the date, location, nature of the work, and the names of the officials and laborers involved. These records allowed the curator aquarum to track problem spots, budget for recurring repairs, and identify negligence. Inscriptions found near aqueducts sometimes commemorate major repair works, complete with the name of the emperor or governor under whose authority they were completed, a political reminder that even maintenance was an opportunity for public image. The schedule doubled as a form of surveillance against water theft. Illegal taps, clandestine fistulae, were a chronic problem. Unauthorized users would bore into channels or attach pipes directly to mains, diverting water to private estates, workshops, or gardens. Frontinus devotes considerable attention to detecting and removing such connections, noting that they not only reduced public supply, but also damaged the infrastructure. Regular inspections meant that unauthorized pipes could be spotted, removed, and in some cases, replaced with legal connections after the owner paid fees. Coordination was critical. Aqueducts rarely served a single neighborhood, most fed multiple districts, each with different demands. Maintenance schedules had to be staggered so that taking one aqueduct offline for repairs did not cripple the city's supply. This required constant communication between teams working miles apart, often in rough terrain, without the benefit of modern signaling. Couriers, flags, and even water-level markers served as communication tools. The beauty of the Roman system was that it embedded maintenance into the very identity of the aqueducts. These were not one-time marvels left to crumble after ribbon cutting. They were living systems with a pulse measured in inspection dates and repair intervals. And yet, even with this structure, the balance was fragile. Delays in one section could cascade into shortages, disputes, and political tension. Which leaves an important question. What happened when that balance failed, when repairs were delayed, inspections skipped, or entire aqueducts allowed to fall silent? When Rome's maintenance rhythm faltered, the silence of water became as palpable as its flow. The interruption was not always dramatic, no single, catastrophic collapse of an arch or sudden flood of a valley, but rather a gradual, creeping failure that began invisibly and ended in disruption. The Romans knew that their water system was only as strong as its weakest section, and when inspections were delayed or repairs neglected, decay began its slow but steady work. The earliest symptom was often pressure loss. Public fountains that once arched gracefully into stone basins would trickle. Baths would find their pools filling more slowly, requiring attendants to ration hours or close certain rooms. Bakers, who relied on water-powered mills, would notice their millstones turning sluggishly. For the average Roman, these changes were subtle but frustrating, and they hinted at deeper trouble upstream. If a leak went unrepaired, it worsened with the seasons. Water flowing through a crack widened it, wearing away mortar and stone. In summer, reduced flow rates from the source magnified the loss. In winter, freezing could break apart weakened joints. Over months, a small seep could become a gap large enough to undermine an entire section of channel, leading to partial collapse. Blockages were just as dangerous. Without regular clearing, mineral deposits narrowed the channel, slowing the current and allowing sediment to settle. Debris, leaves, branches, even animal carcasses might lodge in the narrowed gap, further impeding flow. In enclosed sections, stagnant water could foul, producing unpleasant odors and, in extreme cases, becoming a breeding ground for disease. If the blockage went unnoticed, pressure could build behind it, cracking the channel walls and forcing water to spill into surrounding soil. Vegetation intrusion posed another slow threat. Tree roots grew imperceptibly but persistently, widening hairline cracks, displacing stones, and creating new pathways for water to escape. An aqueduct overgrown for a single season might still be serviceable. Left for several years, it could become a ruin, the once precise channel choked by roots and soil. When maintenance truly collapsed, whether from political unrest, war, or financial strain, the consequences could reshape a city's life. In the late Empire, as central control weakened, some aqueducts fell entirely out of use. Archaeological evidence from certain provincial towns shows aqueduct channels silted up and abandoned, replaced by wells or small-scale cistern systems. These were makeshift solutions, sufficient for survival but far from the abundance the aqueducts once brought. The political implications were serious. In Rome itself, the loss of water supply could trigger public unrest. Baths closed, fountains ran dry, and industries reliant on water faltered. Senators and emperors alike understood that water was both a necessity and a symbol of stability. Repairing a failed aqueduct could become a political act, restoring not just function but public confidence. In some cases, repairs were heroic in scale. Entire sections of collapsed channel were rebuilt with reinforced arches. New conduits were laid alongside damaged ones to bypass the worst sections. Inscriptions commemorating such works often read like victory monuments, listing the officials responsible and the scope of the restoration. These were opportunities to demonstrate competence, generosity, and power. Yet not every failed aqueduct was restored. In remote provinces, where the population declined or the tax base shrank, maintenance could become too costly to justify. Here, the rhythm broke permanently. Water systems that had once pulsed with daily inspections and seasonal repairs became silent monuments, their channels dry, their arches serving as little more than shade for shepherds and travelers. The decline of maintenance in the later empire offers a kind of historical caution. Rome's aqueducts were not indestructible marvels but delicate systems whose survival depended on steady, unglamorous labor. Without that labor, without the schedules, inspections, and constant minor repairs, even the greatest engineering could not stand against time, weather, and neglect. For modern cities, the lesson is clear. Infrastructure is not a one-time achievement. It is a living thing, sustained by discipline as much as by stone and mortar. The Romans knew this intimately, and for centuries they mastered the art of keeping water on time. Their aqueducts did not survive because they were built well alone, but because they were cared for until the day they were not. And so, as you walk along the quiet ruins of an aqueduct today, arches silhouetted against the sky, you might wonder, how many other systems in history, grand, vital, and celebrated, have vanished, not in a single moment of disaster, but in the slow erosion of neglect? Story 5. The Ledger of Salt Accounting in the Han Dynasty. You sit at a low wooden desk in the dim interior of a Han Dynasty government storehouse. Outside, the early morning haze lies heavy over the riverbank, where barges laden with pale, crystalline cargo wait to be unloaded. The salt glitters faintly in the filtered light, not in chunks, but in granular mounds, packed in baskets and sealed with reed matting. This is not merely a commodity. In the Han Empire, salt is state business, and every basket that passes through the doorway must be weighed, recorded, and taxed. By the 1st century BCE, the hand court had turned salt into one of its most reliable sources of revenue. It was too important to leave entirely to private merchants. Salt was vital for preserving food, especially in the inland provinces far from the sea. It was also essential for feeding armies on the frontier, where fresh supplies could not be guaranteed. The state's involvement began not with the physical extraction which was still carried out by private producers in coastal salt pans, inland brine wells, and mineral springs, but with control of its distribution and sale. The heart of this system was the ledger. Every transaction, from the arrival of a barge to the departure of a single cart, had to be recorded in brush-written characters on bamboo or wooden slips. The clerks, often young men trained in arithmetic and bureaucratic protocol, sat in rows, their desks covered with slips, brushes, inkstones, and small abacuses. They wrote with a steady, practiced hand, noting the date, source, weight, purity, and intended destination of each shipment. Salt was measured in gin, roughly half a kilogram, and taxed according to weight and quality. Coarse salt from inland wells fetched a lower price than the finer, white crystals from coastal pans, but both were taxed. The Han government issued permits for merchants to transport and sell salt, each with a specified quantity and route. These permits were also recorded in the ledgers, cross-referenced against actual shipments to prevent fraud. Fraud was, of course, an ever-present challenge. Merchants might bribe weighers to understate cargo weight or attempt to slip untaxed salt into legitimate shipments. To counter this, the government employed inspectors Jianyan who traveled unannounced to storehouses, weighing cargo and checking ledgers for discrepancies. Penalties for falsification could be severe: confiscation of goods, fines, or, in extreme cases, forced labor. The ledger system extended beyond the storehouse. Provincial salt offices compiled monthly reports, which were sent to the capital at Chang'an. There, officials in the Ministry of Revenue collated the figures from across the empire, tracking how much salt was produced, how much was sold, and how much tax revenue was generated. These summaries were not just for bookkeeping. They informed decisions about tax rates, military provisioning, and even infrastructure spending. Salt taxes were predictable, and in a largely agrarian economy subject to the volatility of harvests, that predictability was gold, or rather, silver. Grain taxes fluctuated with drought, flood, or pestilence, but salt flowed steadily from wells and pans year-round. The stability of this revenue allowed the Han court to fund long-term projects like the repair of frontier fortifications and the expansion of imperial roads. The storehouses themselves were built for function, not comfort. Thick mud-brick walls kept the interior cool and dry, while narrow windows admitted just enough light for work without letting in too much humidity. Salt was stored on raised platforms to keep it off the damp ground. The baskets were stacked in neat rows, each tagged with a slip indicating its origin and weight. Clerks and laborers moved constantly between the storage platforms, the weighing station, and the desk rows, their footsteps muffled on the packed earth floor. The flow of salt was seasonal in rhythm, even if steady in revenue. In coastal regions, production peaked in late summer, when evaporation was fastest. In inland brine wells, production was more evenly spread, but transport could be disrupted by winter freezes or spring floods. The ledgers reflected these patterns, with spikes in recorded shipments from certain regions at predictable times. The language of the ledger was formulaic, almost ritualistic. Dates followed the imperial calendar, with rain years and cyclical characters. Quantities were written with precision, using specific numeric characters to minimize ambiguity. Even the phrasing of descriptions was standardized, so that any clerk across the empire could understand the entry without local interpretation. This uniformity was part of what made the Han bureaucracy so effective and so durable. And yet, as you watch the clerks dip their brushes into ink, you can't help but wonder, how did such a vast network of ledgers and reports avoid becoming paralyzed by its own complexity? With shipments moving across thousands of miles, through mountains, rivers, and deserts, how did the Han keep the figures aligned with reality and the salt flowing without bottlenecks? If Section 1 revealed the visible front of the hand salt bureaucracy, the storehouse, the weighing, the ledger's Section 2 lies in the invisible corridors of administration where numbers became policy. In the hand capital of Chang'an, far from the salt pans and brine wells, officials worked in offices lined with scroll racks, their desks piled with bundles of bamboo slips tied in cords. These were the empire's nervous system, carrying information from distant provinces into the hands of ministers who decided what to tax, where to invest, and when to intervene. The salt ledgers, once compiled locally, traveled in monthly packets via relay stations along imperial roads. Couriers changed horses at set intervals, ensuring steady progress even across thousands of li. When a bundle arrived in Chang'an, it was logged into the central archive before being distributed to the Ministry of Revenue. There, teams of clerks read the figures aloud in pairs, one reading from the provincial report, the other checking against the capital's copy of permits issued that month. Discrepancies, even as small as half a jin, were noted for follow-up. Accuracy was the cornerstone of the system, but accuracy depended on trust, and trust was enforced through cross-auditing. Inspectors from the capital occasionally appeared unannounced in the provinces, armed with their own scales and their own copies of records. They could bypass local officials, weigh shipments directly, and compare their findings against the submitted ledger. If the shortfall was large enough, the local salt office could face collective punishment, with multiple officials demoted or fined. This collective responsibility discouraged collusion between merchants and individual clerks. The salt tax itself was not uniform across the empire. Rates varied according to distance from production sites and perceived economic capacity of the region. In wealthy, densely populated areas like the lower Yangtze, the government charged higher rates, confident that demand was inelastic. People needed salt regardless of cost. In frontier regions, rates were lower to encourage settlement and stabilize supply lines. Adjustments to these rates were never arbitrary. They emerged from patterns in the ledgers, where dips in shipments or sudden surges in untaxed salt hinted at economic strain or illicit trade. The government's interest in salt went beyond simple revenue. Because salt moved along the same routes as grain, cloth, and metal, its distribution network doubled as a tool for monitoring the empire's transportation system. A disruption in salt shipments often meant a damaged bridge, a flooded road, or increased bandit activity, all of which required swift attention. Thus, the salt ledger became both an economic record and a proxy report on the health of infrastructure. Han accounting practices blended written records with mnemonic discipline. Clerks were trained to hold numbers in mind while recording, to detect irregularities in real time. In some salt offices, the head clerk could recite the current month's figures from memory, including the production totals of major suppliers. This mental tally acted as an internal check. If an incoming report differed too sharply from the expected flow, suspicion was immediate. Despite the efficiency of the system, bottlenecks still emerged. One chronic problem was congestion at distribution hubs, where shipments from multiple sources converged. If the weighing and inspection process fell behind schedule, salt could pile up in storage, exposing it to moisture damage or theft. To prevent this, the Han government experimented with staggered delivery permits, assigning merchants specific arrival days. The ledgers then included not just weights and origins, but also scheduled delivery dates and early form of logistical coordination. The temptation for corruption never disappeared. Merchants might still bribe a clerk to alter an entry, reducing the declared weight and therefore the tax owed. In other cases, the fraud was more elaborate. False permits forged in the style of official documents, complete with fake seals. The government responded with rotating seal patterns, changing the official stamp design each year so that outdated forgeries would be easier to detect. Again, the ledgers recorded these changes, noting which seal was in use during a given period, creating a chain of authenticity. The salt bureaucracy's stability over decades owed much to its redundancy. Each transaction was recorded in triplicate, one copy for the local salt office, one for the provincial governor, and one for the central archive. Discrepancies between copies could reveal tampering, and the existence of multiple records meant that no single theft, fire, or flood could erase the fiscal trail. Still, the vast scale of the operation meant that small errors were inevitable. Some were harmless: a clerk miswriting a character for a place name, or confusing two merchants with similar names. Others were more costly, such as misreporting an entire shipment's weight by a factor of 10. The bureaucratic solution was methodical. The mistaken record was preserved, but annotated in red ink with the correction, ensuring both transparency and continuity. By the end of the Eastern Han period, the salt monopoly had become so ingrained in the empire's economy that it was difficult to imagine governance without it. The salt ledger was not just an account book. It was a mirror of the state's reach, showing in rows and columns the extent of imperial control over resources and people. It also revealed the tension at the heart of Han governance, the desire for central oversight balanced against the reality of local autonomy. But this raises an unavoidable question: what happened when that balance tipped? When local salt offices, far from the capital's watchful eye, began to act in their own interest, and the ledgers ceased to reflect the true flow of salt and silver. The moment when a ledger stops reflecting reality is rarely marked by fanfare. No gong announces it, no clerk proclaims, "We now enter the age of false accounting." It happens quietly, in the spaces between ink strokes and an entry adjusted here, a weight rounded down there. In the hand salt administration, such moments could pass unnoticed for months, even years, until the gap between paper and reality widened too far to conceal. The causes were often as practical as they were political. A remote salt office might be short-staffed after a bad harvest forced young clerks back to their families' farms. An inspector might be delayed by floods, leaving months between audits. Merchants struggling with transport costs might plead with local officials to adjust the books to keep them solvent, promising future loyalty in return. Small acts of leniency, repeated and unreported, became patterns. Sometimes the divergence was deliberate and systemic. A powerful provincial governor might see the salt ledger not as a record to be sent to the capital, but as a tool for building his own base of support. By underreporting production and siphoning off surplus salt for private sale, he could generate hidden income to pay troops, fund local construction, or reward allies. To maintain the illusion of compliance, the governor's clerks would prepare one set of books for Chang'an and another for local use. This dual ledger practice, while risky, was not unknown, and it could persist for years if the governor's political connections were strong enough. The problem for the central government was that salt revenue was deeply interwoven with other fiscal streams. A shortfall in salt tax could ripple outward, reducing funds for road maintenance, lowering the grain stockpile for military garrisons, and weakening the empire's ability to respond to crises. In the later Han period, as political factions vied for control, such vulnerabilities became tools in power struggles. A governor opposed to the court could quietly starve it of revenue without ever lifting a sword. Detecting false accounting required both persistence and luck. Inspectors arriving unannounced might choose to visit a storehouse on a day when the concealed surplus had already been moved. A shipment might be lost to bandit attack on paper, while in reality it had been sold in a neighboring province at twice the official price. In one recorded case, an inspector cross-checked salt shipment weights with the number of transport animals requisitioned and noticed a mismatch. The declared load was too small for the number of mules used. The investigation that followed exposed a network of falsified ledgers stretching across 3 provinces. Even honest clerks could become complicit simply by adapting to what everyone was doing. In an office where weights were habitually rounded down by a fraction, a new recruit might adopt the practice without considering it fraud. Over time, those fractions accumulated into meaningful losses, invisible unless the books were reconciled against physical measurements. When the numbers no longer matched reality, the trust that sustained the system began to erode. Merchants, sensing weaker oversight, grew bolder in skimming salt from shipments. Local officials, realizing the center could not verify every figure, experimented with small diversions of their own. By the late Eastern Han, reports from certain frontier provinces showed salt revenues mysteriously declining, even as population and demand rose, a clear sign that the ledger had become more fiction than fact. The imperial response varied with the political climate. In stable times, the court might send high-ranking commissioners with authority to bypass local hierarchies, seize records, and interrogate officials. In turbulent periods, however, the court could not risk alienating governors whose military support it needed, and so discrepancies were quietly tolerated. This tolerance, once established, was difficult to reverse. The decay of the salt accounting system mirrored the decline of the Han state itself. As central power weakened, the once precise rhythm of weighing, recording, and cross-checking gave way to improvisation and localism. The triple copy record system still existed in theory, but copies no longer matched. The red ink corrections were used less for transparency and more for cosmetic alignment between conflicting reports. The ledger had transformed from a tool of imperial cohesion into an artifact of formality, a book kept because it had always been kept, not because it still served its original purpose. And yet, even in decline, the structure of the salt bureaucracy left traces that outlived the dynasty. Later regimes from the Tang to the Ming revived state control over salt, sometimes citing Han-era methods as precedent. They studied the old ledgers, noting how their precision in the early empire gave way to manipulation in the late. The Han's cautionary example taught them that a monopoly could enrich a state, but only if the accounting remained credible and the enforcement impartial. Today, archaeologists still recover fragments of those bamboo ledger slips from dry desert storehouses and buried archives. Many bear the neat, deliberate brushstrokes of a system that once believed in the power of numbers to hold an empire together. Others show the hasty hand of a clerk writing what he knew was not true. Both, in their own way, are history reminders that, in the governance of great states, collapse can begin not with rebellion, but with the quiet, almost invisible moment when the numbers begin to lie. So, as you imagine the crackle of a bamboo slip being tied and sealed for the journey to Chang'an, you might ask, in how many other times and places have empires trusted their survival to ledgers, only to discover too late that the truth had been written out of them? Story 6. The quiet bridges of the Edo roads, Japan's forgotten crossings. You are walking along the Takeido, the great coastal road that links Edo, modern Tokyo, to Kyoto in the 18th century. The air smells faintly of the sea, mixed with the dust of travelers' sandals. Ahead, the road dips toward a river whose slow-moving waters catch the pale light of early morning. There is no grand stone span here, no towering arch. Instead, a low wooden bridge stretches across the water, its timbers bound with rope, its posts sunk into the soft riverbank. It is one of hundreds like it, unremarkable in design, but indispensable to the daily functioning of the Tokugawa shogunate's infrastructure. These bridges were not feats of monumental engineering. Most were modest structures, built to last years rather than decades, and repaired seasonally as weather and water wore them down. But they were essential nodes in the shogunate's tightly controlled transportation network. Along the Takeido, Nakasendo, and other official highways, bridges ensured the smooth passage of officials, merchants, pilgrims, and even the elaborate processions of daimyo traveling under the Sankinkatai system. Without them, every swollen river after a heavy rain would become a bottleneck, delaying schedules that were as much about political control as physical movement. The Edo period saw bridge building regulated by a careful balance of central and local authority. While the shogunate oversaw major routes, the responsibility for construction and maintenance often fell to local domains or towns along the road. This decentralized system meant that bridge design varied depending on available materials, local carpentry traditions, and the width and temperament of the river in question. Most bridges in lowland areas used cedar or cypress timber, valued for their resistance to rot. In mountain valleys, pine was common, cut from nearby slopes and hauled down to the river's edge. The post-Hashibashira were driven into the riverbed, sometimes reinforced with bundles of brush to absorb the current's force. Decking planks were laid across beams and secured with rope lashings that could be replaced without dismantling the entire bridge. Nails were used sparingly. Metal was expensive and prone to rust. Seasonal floods were the builders' greatest challenge. Many rivers in Japan could swell dramatically in the rainy season, carrying debris that could smash through rigid structures. To address this, some bridges were designed to be partially dismantled before the rains arrived. Decking could be lifted away, leaving only the posts to face the water's fury. After the flood subsided, the planks would be replaced, the bridge reassembled in a matter of days. This flexibility kept costs down and ensured the road network could recover quickly from seasonal damage. Bridges also had a social role, serving as meeting points and landmarks. Travelers might pause on a bridge to watch fishermen working with cormorants, or to buy snacks from a vendor who set up a stall at the midpoint. In illustrated travel guides of the Edo period, bridges were often depicted as framing views, the arc of the planks leading the eye toward a distant mountain or castle town. Yet these scenes rarely mentioned the unglamorous work that kept the bridges standing. The tightening of lashings, the replacement of warped boards, the constant battle against rot in the humid summer air. The shogunate's interest in bridges went beyond aesthetics. Reliable crossings were essential for enforcing the sankinkadai, the policy requiring daimyo to alternate residence between their home domains and Edo. Processions were carefully timed, and delays at river crossings could disrupt the entire schedule. In some cases, the shogunate ordered bridge repairs to be completed ahead of a particular daimyo's journey, with costs billed to the local domain. This practice reinforced the hierarchy. Infrastructure served the political order, and local communities bore the responsibility for its upkeep. Not all rivers were bridged. The largest, like the Oi River on the Takedo, remained unbridged by shogunate decree, forcing travelers to cross by ferry or on foot during shallow conditions. This was partly to limit the movement of large bodies of troops, a military precaution, and partly to preserve certain revenue streams for ferrymen licensed by the authorities. Thus, the existence of a bridge was as much a political decision as an engineering one. Walking across an Edo period bridge was a tactile experience. The planks flexed slightly underfoot, the rope lashings creaked, and gaps between boards allowed glimpses of the water below. In dry weather, dust collected along the beams. In rain, the boards grew slick. In winter, frost could make the surface treacherous, requiring careful steps from humans and animals alike. For those carrying goods, the bridge was both a relief, no need to ford the river, and a reminder of the shogunate's reach into even the most practical aspects of daily life. Every plank, post, and rope on these bridges had a story: when it was cut, how it was transported, who installed it, and how often it was replaced. These details were recorded in ledgers kept by village officials or town carpenters' guilds. The survival of these modest crossings depended as much on the discipline of paperwork as on carpentry skill. A bridge might not look like a political instrument, but in the Tokugawa era, every crossing on the official roads was part of a larger system designed to bind the country together. Yet as you step off the far end of one such bridge, you might wonder, in a system so dependent on local diligence, what happened when a community could no longer maintain its crossing, and the shogunate's attention was drawn elsewhere. The failure of a bridge in the Edo period rarely made the official chronicles, yet for the people who relied on it, the absence could transform daily life. When a crossing gave way, whether to a late summer typhoon, the slow gnaw of rot, or the sudden violence of ice-laden winter floods, the road it served became, in practical terms, broken. Travelers detoured upstream or downstream, ferrymen worked overtime, and goods piled up on riverbanks. The rhythm of the route changed instantly. A shift felt far beyond the water's edge. In the Tokugawa era, the maintenance of bridges along official highways was a shared responsibility between the shogunate and the local authorities. On paper, the rules were clear. A village or town assigned to a section of road was also responsible for keeping its bridge in working order. In practice, the situation was messier. Some communities could not muster the labor or funds required for timely repairs, especially after consecutive years of bad harvests or heavy tax demands. Timber might be scarce after other construction projects, and skilled carpenters could be occupied elsewhere, leaving the bridge to limp along in partial disrepair until disaster struck. The rivers themselves were not patient. In late spring, snowmelt from the mountains swelled their currents, while summer brought monsoon rains that turned gentle streams into roaring torrents overnight. The careful lashings of hemp rope holding deck planks to beams could loosen in the relentless spray, allowing boards to shift underfoot or vanish altogether. Posts driven deep into the riverbed, sometimes tilted under the pressure of flood-borne debris, tree trunks, uprooted shrubs, and the occasional thatch roof carried away from some unlucky upstream dwelling. When a bridge finally succumbed, the priorities of repair were shaped by politics as much as by need. If the crossing was part of a route used for Sankinkadai processions, urgency was high. The shogunate might dispatch inspectors, demand immediate reconstruction, and advance materials or funds to the local domain to be repaid later in taxes. If, however, the bridge lay on a quieter stretch of road with little strategic value, repairs could languish for months, even years, with travelers resorting to ferries or temporary fords. These ferries were not without their own complications. Licensed ferrymen operated under strict regulation, paying fees for their monopoly rights. A sudden increase in traffic from a missing bridge strained their capacity, leading to long waits and higher fares. In some cases, ferry operators lobbied local officials to delay bridge reconstruction, seeing opportunity in the extended monopoly. The shogunate, wary of local profiteering, kept a watchful if distant eye on such situations, but its intervention was selective. For the people living near the river, a broken bridge altered more than just travel. Farmers bringing produce to market faced longer journeys. Craftsmen delivering goods to neighboring towns had to pay for ferry passage or risk fording the river with their wares. Schoolchildren, pilgrims, and even the traveling physicians who made circuit visits to rural communities found their schedules disrupted. In flood season, when ferries could not operate safely, some villages became temporarily cut off, their isolation a reminder that the shogunate's vaunted road network was never invulnerable. Repairing a damaged bridge began with an assessment, usually conducted by a local headman and one or two experienced carpenters. They measured the remaining posts, checked the integrity of beams, and noted which materials could be salvaged. A formal report was sent to the magistrate overseeing that stretch of road, who approved the plan and allocated the necessary resources or instructed the community to provide them. In wealthier towns, merchants might contribute funds to speed repairs, knowing that a functioning bridge kept trade flowing. The work itself was labor-intensive but methodical. First, any remaining decking was removed, often repurposed for other village uses if still sound. New posts were driven into the riverbed using weighted mallets suspended from tripods, a slow process that required steady teamwork. Beams were floated downriver from cutting sites, guided by poles and ropes before being lifted into place. Decking planks were cut to size on the bank, holes drilled for lashings, and then carried into position. The final step was tightening the rope bindings, a task performed with care, as overly taut lashings could snap under the bridge's own expansion and contraction. Ritual accompanied the practical work. Before reopening the bridge, it was common to place a small offering at one end, rice, sake, or paper charms to appease the river's spirit. These gestures, while not mandated by the shogunate, reflected the blend of pragmatic and spiritual thinking that shaped Edo period infrastructure. A bridge was not just a structure. It was a relationship between people, materials, and the unpredictable force of water. Yet even with timely repairs, some crossings developed reputations as troublesome. Local travel guides occasionally warned readers to expect delays at certain bridges after heavy rains, or to prefer the ferry during particular months. These notes hint at an unspoken reality. The Edo road network was a living system, always in negotiation with the terrain it crossed. The shogunate could decree that bridges be built and maintained, but the rivers did not answer to decrees. By the end of the 18th century, the growing volume of traffic on official roads made bridge reliability an increasing concern. Merchants pressed for sturdier designs, carpenters experimented with better joinery, and some domains invested in stone abutments to anchor the wooden spans. But the basic form, timber posts, beams, decking, and rope lashings remained. It was simple to repair, used local materials, and could be adapted to each river's quirks. The Edo bridges endured not because they conquered the rivers, but because they worked with them, yielding when necessary, rebuilding when possible. Still, one must ask what happened when nature's power, human neglect, and political calculation aligned, leaving a bridge unrepaired for so long that the road itself began to vanish from memory. A bridge can disappear in more ways than one. It can rot and collapse into the water, its timbers carried away by the current. It can be deliberately dismantled, its planks reused for other needs in a season of scarcity. Or more subtly, it can vanish from the road's memory, as travelers and maps adjust to a new reality in which the crossing no longer exists. In the Edo period, this quiet erasure happened more often than official records admitted. Once a bridge lay in ruin for more than a few months, its absence began to change the landscape of travel. The ferrymen who replaced it became the default crossing, establishing habits and routes that slowly hardened into the new norm. Villages that once depended on the bridge's foot traffic adapted their markets to serve waiting passengers instead of passing travelers. Inns shifted their business hours to match the ferry schedule. The road's straight line bent to accommodate the new crossing point. Cartographers in Edo, relying on reports from magistrates and travelers, sometimes left a dismantled bridge marked on their maps for years a phantom structure. But eventually, if no repairs came, the mapmakers redrew the route. A river that had once been spanned became, in the public mind, a natural boundary rather than a line to be crossed without pause. The bridge was gone twice over, physically absent and mentally erased. For the communities responsible for such a crossing, letting it vanish was not always a choice born of neglect. Bridge maintenance was expensive in materials and labor. Hemp rope had to be replaced regularly, timbers transported from distant forests, skilled carpenters paid for their work. If the road's importance declined perhaps because a newer, faster route diverted traffic, then the burden of maintaining the bridge could outweigh its benefits. In such cases, local leaders might quietly decide that the ferry was good enough, especially if ferry fees could offset other expenses. The shogunate's response to these quiet disappearances varied. If the lost bridge was on a major artery like the Takado, inspectors might arrive to demand its restoration, backed by the authority to assign costs to the local domain. But on lesser roads, particularly in remote provinces, the absence might go unnoticed in Edo for years. Even when noticed, it could be deemed not worth the expense to rebuild, especially if alternate crossings existed nearby. The great machinery of centralized control did not always reach into these peripheral spaces. For travelers, the change could be bittersweet. Some mourned the loss of a familiar landmark, a place where they had paused to watch the water or meet a friend coming the other way. Others preferred the ferry, enjoying the slow drift across the current and the conversations that could happen in its confined space. But ferries were bound by weather and daylight, and in times of flood or frost, they could leave travelers stranded on the wrong bank for days. There are records of communities petitioning for bridge restoration decades after one had vanished. These petitions often describe the hardships caused by seasonal isolation, farmers unable to sell surplus crops, children missing lessons in a school across the river, sick villagers unable to reach a physician. In some cases, the shogunate approved reconstruction, sending materials and carpenters under official guard. In others, it refused, citing limited funds or the adequacy of existing ferry services. One such petition from 1834, preserved in the archives of a provincial magistrate, details the case of a bridge lost to a flood 30 years earlier. The villagers had endured by using a ferry, but repeated accidents, including the drowning of a child, had renewed calls for a fixed crossing. The petition was eloquent, invoking not only economic need but also moral duty. A bridge binds not only the shores of a river but the hearts of those it joins. Despite its appeal, the request was denied. The ferry continued until the Meiji period, when a modern steel truss bridge finally spanned the river. The fate of these forgotten bridges reveals something about the nature of infrastructure under the Tokugawa system. Roads and crossings were not immutable features of the landscape. They were contingent, sustained by continuous investment of resources and will. When that investment stopped, the physical structures decayed quickly, and the habits of travel shifted even faster. The shogunate's web of control, though impressive on paper, was in reality a collection of local agreements constantly renegotiated between center and periphery. By the closing decades of the Edo period, foreign visitors arriving in Japan noted the contrast between well-maintained stretches of the main highways and the more modest, sometimes unreliable crossings on lesser roads. To some, it was a sign of provincial backwardness. To others, it was simply evidence that Japan, like any country, allocated its energies where they mattered most politically. Standing today on a modern bridge that spans a river once crossed by such a forgotten structure, it is hard to imagine the fragility of that earlier network. Yet if you listen to the water and watch the currents, you may catch a glimpse of how easily the balance could tip, how a bridge could disappear not in an instant of disaster, but in the slow, deliberate forgetting of a road that no longer needed it. So perhaps the quiet question left by these lost crossings is this: when a bridge is gone, is it the river that divides, or is it the road that chooses not to connect? Story 7. The Post-Town Pillows, how Edo-era travelers slept between roads. Imagine arriving at a post town along the Nakasendo after a day of walking from sunrise to dusk. Your legs ache, your sandals are worn thin, and your pack feels heavier with each step. The town begins as a scatter of houses along the road, then tightens into a denser stretch of shops, inns, and tea houses. Lanterns are being lit as the sky deepens into blue-gray. The smell of grilled river fish and miso broth drifts from open doorways. You are here to rest, but in the Edo period, rest was as much a transaction as a comfort. Post towns, shukubamachi, were spaced at deliberate intervals along the official highways, close enough for travelers to reach one by nightfall, yet far enough apart to control the flow of people and goods. They served as rest stops, checkpoints, and miniature marketplaces. Each had at least one hanjin principal inn for high-ranking officials, one wacky hanjin secondary inn for lower-ranking but still notable travelers, and a scattering of common inns, hatego, for ordinary people. For those of more modest means, there were also simple sleeping rooms above shops, or even straw mats in stable lofts. The hanjin were not businesses in the usual sense, they were obligations. The families who operated them were often wealthy merchants or village leaders, granted the status and burden of hosting officials traveling under shogunate orders. Guests could include daimyo on sankinkatai, inspectors, and court nobles. These lodgings had large, clean rooms, thick futon bedding, and well-prepared meals, all provided according to rank. The hanjin staff kept detailed records of each guest's arrival, departure, and expenditures, sending copies to the magistrate. Common inns, hatego, by contrast, lived by attracting as many paying customers as possible. Their prices varied with amenities, better bedding, more generous meals, or private rooms cost more. A basic stay might mean sharing a large tatami room with several strangers, separated only by thin paper screens, or, in cheaper lodgings, by nothing at all. Privacy was rare. Warmth, however, was guaranteed by the press of other bodies in winter. The bedding itself was an object of careful maintenance. In a time before commercial laundries, innkeepers relied on sunny days to air out futons, beating them with bamboo sticks to remove dust and moisture. Pillows could be filled with buckwheat husks, beans, or even wood shavings, firm, cool, and to modern sensibilities not especially inviting. Yet travelers often brought their own small cloths to wrap around the pillow for familiarity and hygiene. Meals were included in most stays, and their quality was a point of competition among Hatego. A standard offering might be rice, pickled vegetables, and a small portion of fish or tofu. More expensive inns added side dishes, hot soup or fresh seasonal items, river fish in summer, simmered root vegetables in winter. For travelers of limited means, the option to bring one's own food existed, though it could lead to awkwardness with innkeepers, who depended on meal sales for profit. Sleeping arrangements reflected both economy and etiquette. Mixed-gender rooms were avoided unless the travelers were family. Men and women traveling together without formal ties sometimes arranged for adjoining spaces separated by a screen, though everyone in the room could hear every word. Lights were extinguished early, partly to save oil, partly to maintain order. Snoring, coughing, and the occasional restless sleep talker were part of the soundscape. Not all post towns offered a fixed roof to every traveler. Those arriving late, after inns had filled, might sleep in a tea house if the owner was accommodating, or in a stable alongside pack horses. Some towns had official lodging quotas for itinerant laborers and pilgrims, placing them in the least expensive quarters or, in certain seasons, in communal shelters built for overflow. For the poorest, the night could be spent huddled under eaves or in the lee of a storehouse, shielded from wind if not from cold. Despite the range of accommodations, all travelers passing through a post town were subject to registration. The Hatego owner or household head took down each guest's name, home province, reason for travel, and destination, forwarding the information to the local magistrate's office. This system was part of the shogunate's broader surveillance of movement, a reminder that rest was never entirely free from oversight. A night's stay also carried a certain choreography. After arrival, a traveler would wash often with water from a wooden bucket rather than a bath, change into lighter robes, and take a meal. If the town was lively, they might visit nearby shops before dark, buying small gifts or replenishing supplies. Conversation with fellow lodgers was common, especially among those who traveled the same routes regularly. By the time the lamps were extinguished, most were already lying down, listening to the faint hum of insects outside or the muffled footfalls of late-arriving guests. These post-town beds, whether luxurious or bare, were a microcosm of Edo society. Rank determined comfort, money determined choice, and rules determined access. Yet all shared one truth. The day's journey ended here, with the slow surrender to sleep under the weight of the road's dust. And as you drift off in one of these rooms, you might wonder, what did it mean for a place to profit from exhaustion? And how did the business of beds shape the rhythms of travel itself? Once you were settled into your allotted sleeping space in a post-town, the experience of the night was shaped not only by the bedding but also by the invisible net of etiquette. Edo period inns, from the Grand Hanjin to the humblest Hatego, were not just places of rest. They were spaces where strangers shared air, walls, and sound. In such close quarters, politeness was more than a virtue. It was a form of survival. The most basic rule was to keep your voice low. Rooms in most Hatego were divided by shoji paper sliding screens or fusuma thicker, opaque papered panels. These offered visual privacy but no barrier to sound. A conversation in one room could be clearly heard in the next. As a result, travelers developed the art of speaking in murmurs, particularly after nightfall. It was understood that raised voices were the mark of a rude or drunken guest, someone who had already broken the social contract. Even so, total silence was rare. Inns were full of incidental noise, the rustle of bedding as people shifted, the creak of floorboards under the footfalls of a serving girl carrying a last pot of hot water, the muted splash from a courtyard well. Outside, a dog might bark or a cart rumble past on the road. Some travelers found these sounds comforting, the signs of life continuing beyond their own fatigue. Others, particularly those unaccustomed to communal lodging, lay awake irritated, wishing for the kind of solitude almost no one could afford on the road. Eavesdropping, while impolite, was inevitable in such a setting. A snatch of conversation between merchants in the next room, a whispered prayer from a pilgrim, the half-heard negotiation between a traveler and the innkeeper about leaving before dawn, these moments slipped into the minds of nearby guests whether they wanted them or not. Many learned to tune out what they heard, or to pretend they had not noticed. But the temptation to listen could be strong, especially if the topic hinted at news from distant provinces or the outcome of some political intrigue. The architecture of the inns made such overhearing easy. Most rooms opened onto a shared corridor or common space, and the thin walls were built for lightness and economy, not for soundproofing. High-ranking officials in Hanjin inns had thicker partitions, but even there, the creak of a servant's sandals or the murmur of an attendant outside the sliding door was unavoidable. At the lower end of the accommodation scale, shared rooms erased any notion of privacy altogether. In these spaces, etiquette dictated that one keep to their allotted portion of the floor, often marked by a simple line in the tatami pattern or by the placement of the bedding. Feet were kept toward the center of the room, heads toward the wall, a practice both practical, to avoid collisions during the night, and respectful. If someone needed to leave in the dark, they moved with exaggerated care to avoid stepping on another's futon. Bathing before bed was a luxury rather than a given. In some towns, communal baths existed, but in many inns, a traveler might only receive a small basin of hot water for washing hands and face. Cleanliness was maintained more by habit and modesty than by modern standards. This meant that the night air in a room of several people could be thick with the mingled scents of travel, dust, sweat, the faint tang of straw mats, and the lingering aroma of the evening meal. Light discipline was another shared practice. Oil lamps or candles were extinguished at an agreed-upon time, partly to conserve resources and partly for safety. Fire was a constant fear in Edo-period towns, where wooden buildings and paper walls could turn a single spark into a disaster. In some inns, a night watchman patrolled with a small covered lantern, ready to intervene if he spotted a guest attempting to relight a candle indoors. Outside the room, the town itself had its own night rhythm. In larger post towns, certain shops stayed open later, serving snacks or warm drinks to night owls. The sound of a shamisen from a tea house might drift faintly into the upper floors of an inn. In quieter towns, the main road fell silent after the last travelers arrived, leaving only the wind and the occasional call of a night bird. For those who couldn't sleep, whether from discomfort, noise, or a restless mind, there were limited options. One could step quietly into the courtyard to cool off, or sit in the common area sipping tea if the innkeeper allowed it. Sometimes, sleepless travelers found themselves in quiet conversation with others in the same state, exchanging stories until fatigue overcame them. But the night was not always uneventful. Inns, like any gathering place, could be sites of theft. Pilgrims were warned to keep their small valuables, coin purses, documents, amulets close at hand, even when asleep. Some travelers tied their belongings to a wrist or ankle with a length of cord, an old trick against stealthy fingers. Innkeepers were responsible for the security of their guests, but in crowded rooms, vigilance was a shared duty. By dawn, the etiquette of the night gave way to the business of the morning. Guests rose quietly, but firmly late risers risked delaying others sharing the same room. Futons were folded, belongings packed, and the thin scent of breakfast rice and miso soup began to filter through the air. What was said and heard in the night was left behind, unspoken, as the road reclaimed its travelers. Still, the closeness of those nights lingered in memory, reminding one that in the world of Edo travel, rest was never entirely solitary. And it leaves us to wonder, in an age when walls were thin and the dark was shared, how much of another person's life did you carry with you when you left the next morning? When a traveler in the Edo period closed their eyes in a post-town bed, they stepped into a realm that was at once personal and collective. Dreams were private, but the circumstances that shaped them, the fatigue, the sounds, the smells, were shared by everyone lying on tatami that night. For many, these dreams were brief flashes between waking intervals, as the body adjusted to unfamiliar rooms and the ear caught the stirrings of others nearby. The sleep itself was rarely deep in crowded Hatego. Travelers accustomed to their own homes found themselves in constant half-awareness, listening for footsteps in the corridor, the splash of water in the yard, the faint creak of a door sliding open. Those used to such nights, merchants, pilgrims, itinerant laborers, had learned to surrender quickly to rest, accepting that comfort was less important than conserving energy for the next day's walk. Inns were not soundproof sanctuaries. The snoring of strangers could form a steady drone, punctuated by coughs or the soft rattle of a pilgrim's prayer beads turning in restless hands. Wind rattled the wooden shutters. In the rainy season, the rhythmic patter on the roof might become a kind of lullaby, carrying even the most anxious minds toward dreams. In winter, the occasional hiss from the brazier as a coal shifted marked the slow passage of the night. For some, the dreams themselves reflected the road. Merchants dreamed of missing cargo or failing to meet a customer. Pilgrims envisioned the temples ahead, the imagined glow of incense smoke rising from altars. Couriers, tasked with urgent messages, sometimes woke in a start, heart pounding, convinced they had dropped the dispatch in the river. These anxieties were not confined to the waking hours. The road followed its travelers into sleep. But dreams could also be softened by the day's small pleasures. A hot bowl of miso soup, the unexpected sight of early plum blossoms, a brief conversation with a friendly stranger, these might thread into the night's visions, blurring into landscapes both familiar and unreal. The mind, exhausted yet filled with the sensory impressions of travel, stitched together fragments in its own quiet way. The quality of the bed itself influenced the night. In the Hanjin, thick futons and fresh coverings allowed for deeper rest. In common Hatego, where bedding might be worn thin from years of use, the body felt every ridge of the tatami beneath. Pillows filled with buckwheat husks or wood shavings could be surprisingly supportive or, for the unaccustomed, stubbornly uncomfortable. Even so, for a weary traveler, the sensation of lying down at all was a kind of luxury. Midnight brought its own rituals. Some inns employed a watchman who struck a block of wood at set intervals, both to mark the time and deter thieves. This slow, steady sound became part of the dreamscape for guests, folding into their subconscious like a distant drum. In larger towns, bells from nearby temples might chime during the night, counting the hours in tones that drifted over the rooftops. Sleep in a post-town was also shaped by anticipation. The journey ahead loomed over the night's rest. How many rai remained to the next destination, whether the weather would hold, if the ferry would be running at the next river crossing. This anticipation could lighten sleep, causing travelers to wake before dawn, heart already leaning toward the road. In the early light, the dreams dissolved quickly. Guests stirred as the faint glow of morning filtered through paper screens. The sounds of preparation began: the folding of bedding, the soft clatter of bowls in the kitchen, the shuffle of feet in the corridor. By the time breakfast was served, the night was already being pushed into memory, its details fading behind the practical tasks of departure. And yet, for some, those nights in post-towns lingered long after the journey was over. They remembered the warmth of shared rooms in winter, the low murmur of voices behind thin screens, the way the smell of rice and tea greeted them in the morning. They remembered that the road was not only a place of movement, but also a place of pause, of laying down one's burdens, however briefly, and surrendering to the quiet vulnerability of sleep among strangers. Looking back, one might ask, in the endless motion of travel, was it the road or the bed that left the deeper imprint on the soul? Story 8. The Ledger of Salt. Quiet accounts from the salt roads of medieval Japan. Imagine a time when the most valuable substance in your household was not a coin, not silk, not even rice, but salt. In medieval Japan, before refrigeration and modern preservation, salt was the quiet guardian of life. Without it, fish rotted, vegetables spoiled, and entire communities along the coast and in the mountains risked hunger through the long winters. More than a seasoning, salt was a preservative, a medicine, and a commodity that bound together distant provinces through the steady rhythm of trade. The geography of Japan meant that salt production was concentrated along certain coastal areas, particularly the inland sea, where the combination of calm waters, steady sun, and sandy beaches made salt-making feasible. Regions like Harima and Suo became known for their Agihama salt fields, a labor-intensive process where seawater was drawn onto sand flats, evaporated under the sun, and collected before being boiled down to crystal form. The work was repetitive and dictated by the weather. Clouds and rain could undo days of effort. Laborers hauled buckets, raked sand, and watched the wind as carefully as farmers watched the sky for rain. But the demand for salt stretched far inland, to mountain villages that had no direct access to the sea. There, the preservation of fish, pickled vegetables, and even meat relied on a steady supply brought by merchants along well-worn paths. These were the salt roads, Shio no Michi, narrow, sometimes treacherous routes winding through valleys and over passes. Pack horses laden with heavy barrels trudged slowly, their pace determined by the slope and the stability of the load. Porters carried smaller amounts on their backs, balancing the weight with practiced steps over uneven ground. Salt's value was such that it often became a medium of trade in itself. A farmer might exchange rice or firewood for a measured amount of salt. Inns along the salt roads accepted payment in salt from traveling merchants, knowing they could resell it to local buyers. Even temples received salt as offerings, not only for practical use in preserving food for monks, but also for its symbolic purity in rituals. The politics of salt could be as sharp as its crystals. Domains with salt production guarded their methods and sometimes imposed restrictions on sales to rival territories. One of the most famous examples was during the Sengoku period, when the Usugi clan, at odds with the Hojo, found their supply of salt cut off by coastal enemies. Take the Shinjin, though a rival of Usugi Kenshin, sent salt into Usugi territory rather than take advantage of their weakness, leading to the famous phrase, "Give salt to your enemy." It was a gesture that was as much about reputation as about logistics. In a society where honor and long-term strategy mattered, generosity could be more powerful than a siege. Merchants who worked the salt trade were often specialists, knowing not just the sources and prices, but also the storage methods needed to keep salt from clumping or dissolving in humid weather. They recorded weights and measures with meticulous care, as disputes over short deliveries could lead to lasting mistrust. A koku of salt was no small matter in some places. It could feed the preservation needs of a whole village for a year. Transporting salt was hard on both humans and animals. In wet weather, barrels swelled and grew heavier. In winter, ice on the mountain paths slowed progress to a crawl. Accidents were costly. A dropped barrel might lose half its contents to the mud, and there was no recovering the loss. For this reason, salt trains often traveled in groups, both for mutual aid and for protection from bandits. While salt itself was not as enticing to thieves as gold or silk, its value in trade meant it could quickly be converted into cash or goods. Along the routes, the salt trade left subtle marks on the landscape. Villages on the salt roads often had wider stretches of path to accommodate packed trains, extra storage sheds for goods in transit, and inns that catered specifically to the needs of salt carriers, strong meals, secure storerooms, and repairs for harnesses and barrels. Place names sometimes retained references to the trade, with Shio appearing in the names of towns or passes long after the salt merchants were gone. Salt was also tied to medicine. Physicians prescribed it for digestive issues, to clean wounds, and even to guard against certain spiritual afflictions. In festivals, salt was scattered to purify spaces, a practice still seen in sumo wrestling today when wrestlers toss salt onto the ring. For the people who moved it, salt was both a practical good and a spiritual tool, connecting them to a web of beliefs and customs as old as the trade itself. In the great cities, salt's journey from coast to market was invisible to most. It simply appeared at the merchant's stall, measured into small packets for household use. But for those who walked the salt roads, each crystal carried the weight of days spent in wind and rain, the strain of lifting and balancing heavy loads, the constant mental calculation of profit against the cost of the road. And so, when we think of the medieval Japanese economy, we might picture silver mines or rice paddies. Yet the quiet commerce of salt shaped the rhythm of life just as surely. Without it, food would spoil, trade would falter, and the seasons themselves would taste different. It leads us to wonder, in an age where survival hinged on preservation, did salt shape the course of history more than the weapons and banners of war? The salt roads were not just channels of trade, they were living corridors, strung with villages, inns, shrines, and the countless small human dramas of travel. While the barrels of salt were the reason for the journey, the road itself shaped lives as much as the commodity it carried. A typical salt road, Shio no Michai, wound through terrain that tested patience and endurance. Some routes hugged river valleys, where damp air clung to clothing and swollen currents could wash away a crossing in a single night. Others climbed mountain passes, their paths narrow and stony, where a misstep could mean tumbling into a ravine. In spring, these trails were streaked with mud that sucked at a traveler's sandals. In winter, ice crusted the edges of the path, forcing horses to pick their steps with wary precision. Along the way, there were sekisho checkpoints maintained by local authorities. These stations were not just for keeping an eye on arms or contraband. Salt, because of its value, was often taxed or monitored. Carriers would present documents stating their load's origin and destination, and officials recorded the passage in ledgers. While the inspection might be quick for those with the right papers, delays could stretch for hours if disputes over weights or duties arose. For the people who lived along these routes, the salt trade was an anchor for their economy. Innkeepers, hategoya, catered to salt carriers by offering secure storage and hearty meals designed for stamina: grilled fish, miso soup, pickled vegetables. Blacksmiths repaired the iron hoops that bound barrels, while rope makers sold fresh lashings for securing loads. Farmers grew crops not only for themselves, but for the travelers, knowing that each passing pack train meant extra coin in the village coffers. Children along the salt road grew up recognizing the sound of a pack train long before it appeared. The slow clop of horses' hooves, the faint jingle of harness bells, and the calls of the carriers urging the animals forward were part of the seasonal soundscape. In some places, children would run alongside for a stretch, offering water or bits of fruit in hopes of a coin or a handful of salt in return. Religion and commerce intertwined along the route. Small roadside shrines dotted the paths, often dedicated to deities of safe travel or prosperity. Carriers, superstitious after years on dangerous trails, would pause to bow or leave an offering, sometimes a pinch of salt itself, before attempting a difficult pass. Larger temples near trade hubs offered lodging to merchants at a reduced cost, seeing the hospitality as both a service and a way to attract patronage. The pace of travel was dictated by the weight and nature of the cargo. A horse could carry around 80 to 100 kilograms of salt in 2 balanced barrels, but speed was slow, averaging only 20 to 25 kilometers a day. Human porters carried far less, perhaps 30 to 40 kilograms, but were more nimble on steep or narrow paths where horses could not go. These porters were respected for their endurance, though the work left its mark on their bodies. Bowed backs, calloused shoulders, and joints worn from years of climbing and descending. Accidents were inevitable. A slipped barrel might split on a rock, spilling precious salt into the dirt. While some could be salvaged, much would be lost, and the carrier, depending on their contract, might be held financially responsible. This risk made trust between merchants and carriers essential. Some traders hired escorts for particularly valuable loads, not to fend off bandits, though that was sometimes a concern, but to ensure that, in the event of an accident, there were witnesses to verify what had happened. Banditry, though not constant, was a real threat in certain stretches. Remote passes and forested sections offered concealment, and while salt was not as glamorous a prize as coin or silk, it could be traded quickly in nearby markets. In response, some carriers banded together in convoys, setting out at dawn and aiming to reach known safe villages before nightfall. Word traveled fast along the route. If bandits struck, the news would move ahead of them, allowing other traders to alter their plans. Seasonal challenges also shaped life along the salt roads. In the rainy months, barrels swelled from moisture and sometimes burst their bindings. In summer heat, the strain on pack animals could be severe, requiring more frequent rest stops. Winter brought snow that buried the trail markers, forcing carriers to rely on memory and local guides. Each season left its own rhythm on the road, a cycle as predictable as it was demanding. Merchants kept meticulous records, often in bound ledgers carried in wrapped cloth to protect them from the weather. These books contain not just numbers, but notes about particular inns, reliable carriers, and dangerous sections of the road. Over time, these ledgers became a kind of collective memory for a merchant house, guiding decisions about when to travel, who to trust, and where to invest. Villages at key junctions became informal marketplaces, where carriers might stop for a day to sell directly to local buyers rather than continuing to a larger town. These markets were modest but vital, supplying mountain communities with a commodity that otherwise would have been scarce. The social aspect of these gatherings was equally important. News from the coast, from the capital, or from distant provinces traveled with the salt. Despite the hard labor and the risks, many who lived along the salt roads took pride in their role. They saw themselves as part of a chain that connected coast to mountain, fishery to farm, preservation to plate. Without them, the cycle of food storage and the survival it enabled would falter. Yet one can imagine a question lingering in the mind of a salt carrier, stepping out into the dawn mist with another day's load. Was the salt moving because the people needed it, or because the road itself demanded to be traveled? By the late Edo period, the salt roads had already seen centuries of footsteps, hoofprints, and wheel ruts. The rhythm of the trade, the slow, steady movement from sea to mountain, was so deeply woven into local life that it seemed eternal. But like all roads, these too had an end. The first cracks in the old order came not from a shortage of salt, but from changes in how it was produced and moved. Coastal salt making became more efficient, with larger evaporation fields and improved boiling techniques that reduced waste. Merchants began consolidating shipments, moving greater quantities along fewer, more direct routes. This consolidation meant some smaller roads saw less traffic, and villages that had thrived on the passing trade began to quiet. The rise of river transport further shifted the balance. Barges could carry tons of salt far more quickly than a caravan of pack horses, and the growing network of navigable waterways connected coastal production sites with inland markets. The once essential highland passes became less traveled as merchants opted for speed and volume over the traditional routes. Yet the most profound change arrived with the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century. Modern roads and railways cut across the landscape, linking coast and city in ways the salt roads never could. Trains could haul vast loads of salt now, industrially refined to distant destinations, in a fraction of the time it took a caravan. The physical demands that had defined the salt carrier's life were rendered obsolete almost overnight. For the porters and small-scale merchants, this was both liberation and loss. The work had been grueling, but it had also been their livelihood, their identity. Some adapted, finding employment in rail freight or coastal shipping. Others drifted away from the trade entirely, taking up farming, shopkeeping, or wage labor in the cities. A few stubborn carriers continued along the old roads for local deliveries, but the steady streams of travelers dwindled to a trickle. Villages along the salt roads felt the change in their bones. Inns closed, their shutters drawn permanently. Storehouses once filled with barrels of salt stood empty or were repurposed. Blacksmiths and rope makers who had supplied the caravans found fewer customers. Seasonal markets shrank, their bustle replaced by a quieter, more insular rhythm. The shrines and roadside markers remained, but now they blessed far fewer passers-by. Even as the trade faded, memories of the salt roads lingered in local culture. Folk songs recalled the slow climb over misty passes, the calls of carriers urging their horses forward. Place names preserved the old connection towns and villages with Shio in their names, mountain passes still called Shio no Toad, long after the caravan stopped. In some regions, local festivals kept the memory alive, reenacting the arrival of salt carriers with costumed processions and mock deliveries. The ledger books, too, became relics. Some were kept by merchant families as heirlooms, their pages a record of transactions, routes, and weather patterns from decades past. Others were donated to temples or local archives, offering historians a window into a world where salt was counted in handfuls, and each journey was a careful calculation of time, risk, and reward. By the 20th century, the salt roads existed more in memory than in practice. They became the subject of nostalgic essays, travel sketches, and local history projects. Walking them now without the burden of a 40-kilogram load became an act of connection to the past. Travelers traced the same bends in the road, stopped at the same village crossroads, and imagined the slow approach of a caravan in the distance. There is a certain irony in the fact that salt itself has endured as an everyday staple, while the vast infrastructure built to move it has vanished. In a modern kitchen, a pinch of salt is so commonplace that it hardly invites a second thought. Yet for centuries, that pinch represented the labor of dozens of hands, the strength of pack animals, the patience of merchants, and the quiet persistence of roads carved into mountainsides. Standing today on an old salt road, perhaps in a shaded pass where moss now covers the stones, it's possible to feel the stillness that replaced the steady pulse of trade. The air is filled with the sound of birds instead of the jingle of harness bells. The road no longer demands its travelers, but it remains, a faint trace of a time when salt bound coast and mountain in a cycle as vital as the seasons. And it leaves one to wonder, in the end, was it the salt that shaped the road, or was it the road that gave salt its power?